Help me get revenge. Those were the last words I ever expected to hear from my grandmother. Not because she was weak. Not because she couldn't stand up for herself. But because Margaret Mitchell was the strongest person I had ever known. At 78 years old, she was the kind of woman people stood up for when she entered a room. Veterans saluted her. Neighbors brought her pies at Christmas. Local politicians asked her to speak at Memorial Day ceremonies. She had spent 23 years serving as a Navy nurse. She had spent the next 30 helping everyone else. And yet there she was, sitting alone in her kitchen, crying, while my own parents sat in the next room dividing up her life. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. At the time this happened, I had just finished a training assignment in Virginia that ended 3 days earlier than expected. Instead of waiting around at the base, I decided to drive home to Ohio and surprise Grandma. I hadn't seen her in almost 4 months. We talked on the phone every Sunday, but it wasn't the same. Grandma had practically raised me. After my grandfather died, my parents were always busy working, chasing promotions, worrying about money. Grandma was the one who attended my school plays. Grandma taught me how to ride a bike. Grandma sat beside my hospital bed when I broke my arm at 12. And Grandma was the person who inspired me to join the Navy. I figured she'd be thrilled to see me. I never imagined what I was about to walk into. The driveway was crowded when I arrived. My father's truck was there. My mother's SUV. My Uncle Ray's old Ford pickup. That was unusual. Nobody had mentioned a family gathering. I parked and walked toward the front porch. As I approached the house, I heard voices coming through an open window. Loud voices, arguing voices. I recognized Uncle Ray immediately. "We should sell the place before winter," my father replied. "That's exactly what I'm saying." I stopped walking. Something about the conversation felt wrong. Then Ray laughed. "We can probably get $400,000 for the house alone." My stomach tightened. The house? What house? Grandma's house? I moved closer. My mother's voice joined in. "And her savings account isn't bad either." I froze. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. Then my father spoke again. "Once she's in assisted living, she won't need most of it anyway." I felt a flash of anger so sudden it almost made me dizzy. Assisted living. What were they talking about? Grandma was 78, not 98. She still drove herself to church. Still volunteered at the Veterans Center. Still shoveled her own sidewalk when it snowed. Nobody had mentioned assisted living. Nobody. I pushed open the front door. The voices stopped instantly. 3 startled faces turned toward me. "Sarah," my mother said. "What are you doing here?" I looked at each of them. Nobody smiled. Nobody looked happy to see me. Instead, they looked uncomfortable. Caught. "Training ended early," I said. My father forced a laugh. "Well, that's a surprise." I glanced at the papers spread across the coffee table. Property estimates, financial statements, real estate brochures. None of them belonged there. "Where's Grandma?" I asked. Nobody answered immediately. That told me everything. Finally, my mother pointed toward the kitchen. "She's back there." Oh, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, alone. A mug of coffee sat untouched in front of her. The moment I saw her face, my heart broke. Her eyes were red. Her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone had taken a piece of her. "Grandma." She looked up. For a second she seemed confused. Then recognition appeared, and she smiled. The kind of smile people give when they're trying not to cry. "Sarah." I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her. The second I did, she broke down. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears. The kind that hurt the most. I held her while anger burned through me. Nobody deserved this, especially not her. After several minutes, she finally pulled away. "I'm sorry," she said. "You have nothing to apologize for." She nodded toward the living room. "They've been here all morning." I already knew who she meant. "What happened?" Grandma stared into her coffee. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she spoke softly. "They think I'm becoming a burden." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "A burden." She gave a sad smile. "They say they're worried about me." The words dripped with disappointment. Not bitterness. Disappointment. That somehow felt worse. I walked toward the living room. I was ready to throw every one of them out of the house. Maybe call the police. Maybe call a lawyer. Maybe both. But before I reached the doorway, a hand closed around my wrist. I looked down. Grandma. For such a small woman, her grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't." I stared at her. "Grandma." "Please." I could see something in her eyes. Not fear. Not weakness. Something else. Something calculating. Something I hadn't seen in years. The same look she used to get when telling stories about difficult days in the Navy. The look of someone thinking 3 steps ahead. I sat back down. What is it? She glanced toward the living room to make sure nobody was listening. Then she leaned closer. So close I could barely hear her whisper. They don't know. I frowned. They don't know what. A faint smile appeared. The first genuine smile I'd seen all day. Then she whispered the words that would change everything. Help me get revenge. I stared at her in shock. Grandma! Revenge. The woman who spent her life teaching forgiveness. The woman who volunteered every Christmas morning. The woman who never said a cruel word about anyone. She squeezed my hand. I don't mean what you think. Then what do you mean? She looked toward the ceiling. Toward the attic. Toward a place I hadn't thought about in years. There is something up there. What? Her eyes met mine. The old military footlocker. I remembered it instantly. An old Navy trunk Grandpa had stored decades ago. Nobody ever opened it. Nobody. Grandma lowered her voice again. They think they know everything. Her smile grew slightly, but they forgot who I am. Then she pointed toward the attic stairs. Help me bring it down. And for the first time that day, I realized my grandmother wasn't defeated. Not even close. She was preparing for battle. And whatever was inside that footlocker, my parents and uncle had absolutely no idea it existed. For the next 20 minutes, I played the role of a Navy officer conducting a covert operation inside her own grandmother's house. Not because anyone was dangerous, but because Grandma insisted. Wait until they're distracted, she whispered. I couldn't help smiling. There was something almost familiar about this version of her. The woman sitting in that kitchen wasn't the fragile, elderly widow my parents seemed to see. This was Lieutenant Margaret Mitchell, retired, but not defeated. The opportunity came when my mother announced she was making coffee. A few minutes later, my father and Uncle Ray followed her into the backyard to discuss real estate listings. Grandma nodded toward the hallway. Now, I climbed the attic stairs while she waited below. The old house creaked beneath my feet. I hadn't been up there since high school. Dust covered everything. Boxes filled with decades of family history lined the walls. Christmas decorations, old furniture, photo albums. And there, exactly where I remembered it, sat the footlocker. A faded navy blue military trunk. The metal corners were scratched. The lock was worn, but it still looked solid enough to survive another century. I carried it downstairs carefully. When I set it on the kitchen floor, Grandma ran her hand across the lid. For a moment, her expression softened, almost as if she were greeting an old friend. I haven't opened this in years, she said quietly. Then she reached into her pocket. A small brass key appeared. The lock clicked open. I expected money, or legal documents, or maybe evidence against my parents. What I found was something completely different. Letters, hundreds of letters, photographs, military records, awards, certificates, newspaper clippings, and memories. An entire lifetime packed into a single trunk. Grandma lifted the first photograph. A young woman in a Navy uniform smiled back at us. Dark hair, confident eyes, perfect posture. I almost didn't recognize her. You were beautiful, she laughed. Past tense, I laughed too, for the first time all day. Still beautiful. Smart answer. We spent the next hour going through the contents. Every item revealed another piece of her life. A Navy Commendation Medal, a Meritorious Service Medal, letters from wounded sailors, photographs from military hospitals, thank you notes from families. I picked up one yellowed envelope. The paper felt fragile. The handwriting belonged to a man named James Carter. Inside was a letter dated 42 years earlier. I began reading aloud. Dear Lieutenant Mitchell. The letter described a young sailor who had been seriously injured overseas. During recovery, he became depressed and nearly gave up hope. According to the letter, Grandma visited him every day, encouraged him, listened to him, refused to let him quit. Years later, he became a teacher, then a principal, then a grandfather. The final sentence made me stop. If you hadn't believed in me, I wouldn't have survived long enough to meet my grandchildren. I looked up. Grandma shrugged. He was a good man. I stared at her. Most people would frame a letter like that. She had stuffed it into a box and forgotten about it. The deeper we searched, the more stories emerged. There were dozens of letters, maybe hundreds. Each one told a similar story. Lives changed. Families saved. People helped. None of which I'd ever heard before. Why didn't you tell anyone about this? She smiled. Because it wasn't about me. That answer perfectly captured who she was. Then we found another folder. This one contained financial records. I assumed they were ordinary bank statements. They weren't. I started recognizing names. My father, my uncle, several cousins. The amounts shocked me. $5,000, $12,000, $20,000, $35,000. Loan after loan. Year after year. Most were marked paid by Margaret. Never repaid. Never mentioned. Never discussed. I looked at Grandma. They borrowed all this? She nodded. They needed help. My jaw tightened. Did they ever pay you back? A small smile appeared. You already know the answer. I did. Suddenly pieces of my childhood started fitting together. The summer my parents almost lost their house. Grandma helped. The year my uncle's business failed. Grandma helped. The medical bills. The car repairs. The college tuition. Grandma helped. Again, and again, and again, while somehow managing to build a life of her own. The realization made me angry. Not because she had been generous, because they had forgotten. Do they know how much you've done for them? I asked. Grandma considered the question. At one time, yes, and now, she looked toward the living room. I think people sometimes rewrite history when gratitude becomes inconvenient. The words hit hard, because they were true. A few minutes later, she handed me a worn leather journal. This matters more than the money. I opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten entries spanning decades, notes about family, lessons from military service, personal reflections. The handwriting remained neat and disciplined throughout. One entry caught my attention. It had been written shortly after my grandfather died. I read silently. Today I learned that grief and responsibility can occupy the same room. I miss him terribly. But the children still need me, so tomorrow I will get up and continue. I swallowed hard. Grandma had never stopped continuing. Not once. The more we talked, the more I understood why her tears hurt so much. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was betrayal. She had spent a lifetime sacrificing for others. Now the people she loved most were treating her like an obstacle standing between them and an inheritance. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me all afternoon. What did you mean when you asked for revenge? Grandma sat quietly for several moments. Then she folded her hands. I don't want to hurt them. I waited. I don't want them humiliated. Another pause. I don't even want them punished. Now I was confused. Then what do you want? Her eyes met mine. The same steady eyes that had guided patients through fear and uncertainty for decades. The truth. The truth, she nodded. They've spent years convincing themselves they're good people. Her voice remained calm. I want them to see what they've become. The kitchen fell silent. Outside I could hear my father laughing. Uncle Ray was saying something about property taxes. Neither had any idea what was happening inside. Grandma reached into the footlocker one final time. This time she removed a thick sealed envelope. Unlike everything else, it looked recent. Very recent. She placed it in my hands. What's this? Her smile returned. A mysterious smile. The kind that immediately made me curious. Something they definitely don't know about. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. For the first time all day, excitement replaced my anger. Because whatever was inside that envelope, it was important enough for Grandma to keep hidden, and important enough to make her believe the truth could still win. I stared at the sealed envelope for several seconds. It wasn't thick. It wasn't marked confidential. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just a plain manila envelope with my grandmother's handwriting across the front. For Sarah. Nothing else. No explanation. No warning. No clues. Yet somehow it felt more important than everything else we'd found inside the footlocker. Open it, Grandma said. I slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside were several documents. At first glance, they looked like ordinary legal papers. Then I started reading, and suddenly I understood why Grandma had smiled. The first document belonged to a lawyer in Columbus. The second belonged to an accountant. The third established something called the Margaret Mitchell Veterans Service Foundation. I looked up. The what? Grandma folded her hands. The foundation. You started a foundation. 5 years ago. I blinked. 5 years. She nodded. I couldn't believe it. My parents talked to her constantly. My uncle visited every month. How could none of them know? Then again, maybe they hadn't been paying attention. I continued reading. The foundation's purpose was simple. Support veterans. provide emergency assistance, fund scholarships for military families, help elderly veterans remain independent in their homes. The organization already existed, legally, fully funded, fully operational. I flipped through the paperwork. The numbers nearly made me whistle. Grandma had quietly donated a substantial portion of her assets. Not enough to leave herself struggling, but enough to make a difference for generations. You did all this by yourself, she smiled. I had help. From who? A lot of good people. For several moments I just sat there, stunned. My parents thought they were fighting over a fortune. In reality, much of that fortune had already been dedicated to helping others. Not hidden, not secret, simply unnoticed. Because nobody had bothered asking what Grandma cared about. They only cared about what she owned. Then I found another document. This one caught my attention immediately. It was a revised estate plan. Recent. Very recent. Signed only 3 months earlier. I began reading. The house would eventually be sold. The proceeds would support the foundation. Some money would still go to family members. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. I read them twice to make sure I understood. Then a third time. And finally I laughed. A genuine laugh. The first one I'd had all day. What? Grandma asked. I looked up. This is brilliant, she pretended innocence. I don't know what you mean. You absolutely know what I mean. The conditions weren't cruel. They weren't vindictive. They weren't even particularly difficult. But they revealed exactly who my grandmother was. Anyone receiving money from the estate had to complete community service. They had to participate in veteran support programs. They had to attend financial responsibility workshops. And they had to provide proof. No shortcuts. No exceptions. No excuses. I couldn't stop smiling. This is your revenge. Grandma shook her head. No. Then what is it? A lesson. That answer sounded much more like the woman who raised me. A woman who believed character mattered more than wealth. A woman who spent her life helping people become better versions of themselves. Not because she enjoyed controlling others. Because she understood something many people forget. Money amplifies character. If you're generous, money makes you more generous. If you're selfish, money often makes you more selfish. Grandma had seen enough of life to know the difference. We spent another hour reviewing paperwork. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. My grandmother wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't scrambling. She wasn't vulnerable. She had planned responsibly. Everything was legal. Everything was organized. Everything was documented. In typical military fashion, she had prepared years in advance, not for revenge, for stewardship. There was a difference. Then her expression changed. The smile disappeared. The sadness returned. I knew something else was bothering her. What is it? She hesitated. Then she answered. They've been pressuring me. I sat upright. What kind of pressure? Sign this. Sign that. Think about your future. Think about what's best. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath. The disappointment. The loneliness. They keep acting like I've already lost the ability to make decisions. That hit me harder than I expected, because many older Americans know exactly what that feels like. The moment people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a problem, a responsibility, a burden, an obstacle. Did they ask directly for money? Grandma laughed softly. Oh yes. How direct? She looked toward the living room. Very. I shook my head. Part of me wanted to march in there and confront all three of them immediately. But another part understood what Grandma was trying to accomplish. She didn't need me to fight. She needed me to witness, to see the truth clearly. As if on cue, voices drifted into the kitchen. My father, Uncle Ray, my mother. They were returning. Grandma quickly gathered the documents, not because she was hiding them, because she wasn't ready yet. The time would come, but not today. A few minutes later, everyone sat around the dining room table. The atmosphere felt strange, artificial, like a family pretending everything was normal. My mother asked about my training assignment. Uncle Ray complained about gas prices. Dad talked about local politics. Meanwhile, nobody mentioned the paperwork scattered throughout the living room. Nobody mentioned assisted living. Nobody mentioned inheritance. The dishonesty was exhausting. Then my father turned toward Grandma. We've been thinking. The words immediately put me on alert. Grandma remained calm. Oh, he smiled. A salesman's smile. One I'd seen before. We found a really nice retirement facility. Grandma took a sip of coffee. Did you? My mother jumped in. They have activities. And transportation. And medical support. Uncle Ray nodded enthusiastically. It would be perfect. I watched Grandma carefully. Her expression never changed. Years of military discipline hid whatever she was feeling. Then Dad pulled a folder from his briefcase. There it was. The real reason for the visit. Paperwork. He slid it across the table. If you sign these, we can start making arrangements. The room became very quiet. I looked down. Property transfer forms. Exactly what I expected. My pulse quickened. I wanted to intervene. Grandma gently touched my arm beneath the table. A silent message. Not yet. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just knowingly. Almost as if she were watching a movie whose ending she already knew. She pushed the folder back toward my father. Not today. His smile faded. Mom, not today. The firmness in her voice surprised everyone, including me. For the first time all afternoon, my father looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. That evening, after everyone left, Grandma stood beside the front window watching their vehicles disappear down the street. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she turned toward me. I think it's time. Time for what? Her eyes sparkled. Not with anger. With certainty. The family meeting. I frowned. What family meeting? The smile returned. The one they're never going to forget. And suddenly, I realized my grandmother wasn't planning revenge at all. She was preparing a reckoning, one built entirely on truth. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed in Ohio. Officially, I was using accumulated leave before returning to my next assignment. Unofficially, I was helping my grandmother prepare for what she called the family meeting. At first, I assumed she meant a gathering around the dining room table. A difficult conversation. An intervention. A confrontation. Something like that. I was wrong. Grandma had something much bigger in mind, and far more effective. The planning began the very next morning. We sat at her kitchen table with coffee and legal pads, the same table where I had found her crying. The difference was remarkable. The sadness hadn't disappeared completely, but now there was purpose, direction, strength. The woman I remembered was returning, not because her pain was gone, because she had decided what to do with it. Who should be there, I asked. Grandma thought carefully. People who know the truth. That answer sounded simple. It wasn't. Over the next hour, she created a list. Retired veterans, former patients, neighbors, church members, community volunteers, people whose lives she had touched over the years. The names filled several pages. I was amazed. At 78 years old, she had built relationships throughout the entire county. Not powerful relationships, meaningful ones. There was a difference. One name caught my attention. Harold Benson. I recognized it immediately. Colonel Benson. Grandma nodded. Retired now. I stared at her. The man had commanded thousands of troops during his career. What does he have to do with this? She smiled. I helped save his life once. I wasn't even surprised anymore. Every day seemed to reveal another story. Another person, another life she'd quietly changed. Ma, as the days passed, calls were made. Invitations extended. No details were shared. Only that Margaret Mitchell would appreciate their presence at a family gathering. The response amazed me. Almost everyone said yes, immediately. No hesitation. No questions, just yes. That alone told me everything. People respected her. Deeply. So, meanwhile, my parents and Uncle Ray continued their campaign. Phone calls increased. Visits became more frequent. Suggestions became pressure. Pressure became frustration. The more Grandma delayed signing documents, the more impatient they became. Fortunately, she had prepared me. Observe, she kept saying. Don't argue. So I observed. One afternoon, I sat quietly in the living room while my father tried once again. Mom, we're only thinking about your future. Grandma nodded politely. I know. You need support. I understand. You shouldn't be handling everything alone. Again, she nodded. Then she asked a simple question. If you're worried about me, when was the last time you asked what I wanted? The room became silent, painfully silent. My father opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't have an answer. Phew. Another day, Uncle Ray arrived carrying brochures. Luxury retirement communities, independent living facilities, assisted care centers. He spent nearly 40 minutes discussing amenities, swimming pools, restaurants, transportation, activities. Finally, Grandma interrupted him. Ray, what? Have you visited me even once this year without wanting something? The question landed like a hammer. His face turned red. He couldn't answer either. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Not because anyone was exposing it, because it exposed itself. People reveal themselves eventually, especially when money enters the conversation. The family meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after I found Grandma crying. The location surprised everyone. Instead of her house, she rented the community hall attached to the local Veterans Center. A modest building. Nothing fancy, but meaningful. Very meaningful. For decades, she had volunteered there. Many veterans considered her family. The day arrived. I arrived early to help with setup. Rows of chairs filled the hall. Coffee stations lined one wall. Photographs stood on display tables. Many came from the Foot Locker. Military photographs. Volunteer photographs. Community events. Years of service captured in images. Looking around, I realized something. This wasn't a trial. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about inheritance anymore. It was about remembering. Guests began arriving shortly after noon. Then more. Then even more. By 1 o'clock, the room was nearly full. Veterans in caps and service jackets. Neighbors. Friends. Former co-workers. Church members. People from every chapter of Grandma's life. The crowd stunned me. I knew she was respected. I hadn't realized how much. Then my parents arrived, followed by Uncle Ray. The confusion on their faces was immediate. My mother looked around the crowded room. What is this? Nobody answered. Not yet. Dad spotted several local community leaders. His expression changed. Now he looked nervous. Good. Maybe for the first time he realized this wasn't going to be another private conversation. At precisely 1:30, Grandma stepped to the front of the room. The conversation stopped instantly. Not gradually. Instantly. That's the kind of respect she commanded. I felt proud just watching her. Straight posture. Calm expression. Quiet confidence. A retired Navy nurse standing before a room full of people whose lives she had touched. "Thank you for coming," she began. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room listened. Every word mattered. She welcomed everyone, thanked them. Then she invited several guests to speak. What followed changed everything. The first speaker was a veteran named Frank. He described meeting Grandma after returning home struggling with depression. She helped him find counseling. She checked on him regularly. She refused to give up on him. Quite honestly, he said, "I don't know if I'd still be here without Margaret." The room grew quiet. My father looked down. Then came a widow whose husband had served in Vietnam. Grandma had helped her navigate benefits paperwork after his death, for nearly a year, without charging a penny, without seeking recognition, without telling anyone. The woman cried while speaking. Several audience members cried with her. Story after story followed. A former patient, a single mother, a disabled veteran, a struggling family. Each person shared a memory, a kindness, a sacrifice, a moment when Margaret Mitchell had shown up when nobody else did. By the 5th story, my mother's eyes were wet. By the 7th, Uncle Ray couldn't look anyone in the eye. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the front carrying a folder. The same folder we had assembled from the Foot Locker. Financial records, loan documents, receipts, history, truth. I looked directly at my parents, then at my uncle. My voice remained calm, professional, measured. Years in the Navy had taught me discipline. Many people here know what Grandma has done for this community. I paused. But very few know what she's done for her family. The room became still. Very still. I opened the folder and began reading. The first loan, the second, the third, the emergency bills she paid, the mortgages she helped save, the businesses she rescued, the tuition she funded. One example after another, year after year, decade after decade. No judgment, just facts. Nothing but facts. And with every page I read, my parents seemed to shrink a little further into their chairs, because for the first time in their lives they were being forced to see the complete picture, not the version they preferred, the truth. And when I finally reached the last page, Grandma slowly rose to her feet. The room turned toward her. She looked at my parents, then at Uncle Ray, and finally she said 6 words that made the entire room hold its breath. "I've changed my estate plans. I've changed my estate plans." The room became so quiet that I could hear the old air conditioner humming near the back wall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My father stared at Grandma. My mother looked confused. Uncle Ray's face went pale. For a brief moment I thought one of them might object. Instead, they simply sat there, waiting, just like everyone else, waiting to hear what would come next. Grandma stood calmly at the front of the room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. In fact, she looked surprisingly peaceful. That was the first thing I noticed. The woman who had been crying at her kitchen table 3 weeks earlier seemed completely different. Not because her pain had disappeared, because she had decided to face it. And there is a kind of strength that comes from that decision. A quiet strength. A permanent strength. The kind no one can take away. She looked around the room. At the veterans. At her neighbors. At her friends. Then finally at her children. My house will eventually be sold. Nobody reacted. That part wasn't surprising. My savings and remaining assets will be distributed according to the new estate plan. Still no reaction. Then she continued. The majority of my estate will support the Margaret Mitchell Veterans Service Foundation. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. My father blinked. What foundation? The question escaped before he could stop himself. Grandma turned toward him. The one I established 5 years ago. The expression on his face was unforgettable. Shock. Pure shock. He looked at my mother. My mother looked at Uncle Ray. Neither knew what she was talking about, because neither had ever asked. Grandma continued. The foundation will provide scholarships, emergency assistance, and housing support for veterans and military families. Several veterans nodded approvingly. One elderly man quietly wiped his eyes. The room understood exactly what this meant. Margaret Mitchell's service wasn't ending. It was continuing, long after she was gone. Then came the part that changed everything. Family members may still receive part of the estate. Relief immediately appeared on my father's face. Then Grandma finished the sentence, but only after meeting certain conditions. The relief vanished. My attorney stood and distributed copies of the estate documents. People began reading, slowly, carefully. The conditions were exactly as I remembered. Community service, volunteer work, veteran support programs, financial responsibility courses, proof of completion, real participation, not symbolic gestures, not signatures on paper, actual effort, actual service, actual growth. My father looked up first. You're serious? Grandma smiled gently. Very. My mother spoke next. Why would you do this? The answer came immediately. Because money without character is dangerous. Nobody argued. Nobody could. For the first time all afternoon, Uncle Ray stood. He looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. I don't understand. Grandma nodded. I know. His voice softened. Do you think we're bad people? The question surprised everyone, especially me, because it sounded honest. Not defensive, not angry, honest. Grandma thought for several seconds before answering. No. The room remained silent. No, Ray, I don't think you're bad people. Then why? Her eyes moved slowly across the room, toward all three of them. You forgot what matters. That was it. Not greed, not evil, not cruelty. For years they had simply drifted. They had become focused on possessions, problems, bills, inheritance, the practical details of life, and somewhere along the way they forgot gratitude, forgot perspective, forgot people. Then Grandma said something I'll never forget. The saddest thing isn't that you wanted my money. She paused. The saddest thing is that none of you asked whether I was happy. Nobody looked at her. Not one of them. Because they knew she was right. Several people in the audience lowered their heads. A few quietly nodded. Not because they were judging my family. Because they recognized the truth. Many families experience some version of it. People get busy. Life gets complicated. Good intentions fade. Relationships become transactions. And sometimes nobody notices until damage has already been done. Then something unexpected happened. My mother started crying. Not dramatic tears. Not attention-seeking tears. Real tears. The kind that arrive when a person finally sees themselves clearly. She covered her mouth, shook her head, and whispered 3 words. I'm sorry, Mom. The room remained silent. Grandma didn't rush to comfort her. She didn't rush to forgive her either. Instead, she allowed the moment to exist, allowed the truth to breathe. A few seconds later, my father stood. I had never seen him look so defeated. Not after losing jobs. Not after financial struggles. Not after difficult years. This was different. This wasn't failure. This was shame. And shame is harder, because it comes from within. I thought we were helping. The words sounded weak even to him. Grandma nodded. I believe part of you thought that. The honesty of her response stunned me. She wasn't trying to destroy him. She wasn't rewriting history. She was acknowledging complexity. Human beings are rarely entirely selfish, or entirely selfless. Usually we're both. At the same time, my father looked down, then slowly sat back in his chair. For the first time that day, he stopped defending himself, stopped explaining, stopped justifying, and simply listened. The meeting continued for nearly another hour. People shared memories. Questions were answered. Legal details were explained. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The inheritance was no longer the focus. Character was. Legacy was. Service was. The things Grandma cared about most. Eventually, the crowd began leaving. Veterans shook her hand. Neighbors hugged her. Friends thanked her. One by one, they departed. Until only family remained. Just the 5 of us. The hall suddenly felt much larger. Much quieter. Nobody spoke for several moments. Then Uncle Ray finally broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Grandma nodded. Yes, it was such a simple response, yet somehow perfect. Not cruel, not dramatic, just honest. My mother moved first. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Grandma. Both women cried. Years of misunderstandings, years of assumptions, years of distance, not erased, but finally acknowledged. My father joined them a moment later. Then Uncle Ray. Soon all 4 stood together. A broken family trying to find its way back. Not fixed, not healed, but moving in the right direction. As I watched Grandma glance toward me, a small smile appeared. The same smile she wore the day she asked for revenge. And suddenly I understood. This had never been revenge. Not really. There were no winners, no losers, no destruction, no humiliation. Just truth. Truth delivered with enough courage to change people. And perhaps that was the most powerful kind of revenge imaginable. Because instead of ruining her family, Grandma had forced them to confront themselves. And that was something none of them would ever forget. The months that followed surprised me. Not because everything suddenly became perfect. It didn't. Real life rarely works that way. People don't transform overnight. Families don't heal in a single conversation. Trust doesn't magically rebuild itself because someone says the right words. The damage had been real. The hurt had been real. And everyone knew it. But for the first time in a long time, something important had changed. We were finally being honest. I returned to active duty a few weeks after the family meeting. My next assignment took me back to Virginia. Life became busy again. Training schedules, administrative work, long days, early mornings, the usual rhythm of military life. But I spoke with Grandma nearly every evening, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Those conversations became the highlight of my day. The changes started slowly, so slowly that I almost missed them. One Saturday afternoon, my father called. That alone was unusual. We had always cared about each other, but we weren't particularly close. Not the way Grandma and I were. "Guess where I am?" he asked. "No idea." "The Veterans Center." I nearly dropped my phone. "The Veterans Center." "Yeah." I waited. I started volunteering. For several seconds I didn't know what to say. Then I smiled. "How's that going?" He laughed. Humbling. A few weeks later, Grandma told me something else. My mother had begun delivering meals to elderly residents in town. Every Tuesday. Without fail. Not because anyone forced her. Not because it was required by the estate plan. Because she wanted to. At first I assumed she was trying to impress Grandma. But months passed, and she kept doing it. Quietly. Consistently. The same way Grandma always had. Even Uncle Ray changed. Though in typical Uncle Ray fashion, he complained about it constantly. According to Grandma, he spent every volunteer shift grumbling. Every community project grumbling. Every veterans fundraiser grumbling. Yet somehow he never missed one. That made me laugh. Some people improve dramatically. Others improve while complaining the entire time. Both count. As the seasons changed, I noticed something else. Grandma smiled more. Not because she forgot what happened. She never did. But the weight she carried seemed lighter. The bitterness she feared had never taken root. That mattered. Because bitterness has a way of damaging the person carrying it. Grandma understood that better than anyone. The following spring, her health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things. Less energy, more doctor's appointments, longer naps, a slower pace. She remained independent, still stubborn, still sharp, still capable of winning any argument she chose to enter. but age was finally beginning to catch up with her. Whenever I had leave, I flew home, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes longer. Those visits became precious, because deep down both of us understood what was happening. We simply didn't say it out loud. One evening, nearly a year after the family meeting, we sat together on her front porch. The same porch where she used to drink coffee every morning. The sun was setting. The neighborhood was quiet. A warm summer breeze moved through the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the evening settle across the town she loved. Then Grandma broke the silence. "Do you remember what I asked you that day?" I smiled. "Help me get revenge." She laughed softly. That wasn't my finest choice of words. "No. It got your attention, though." "It definitely got my attention." For a while she stared at the sunset. Then her expression became thoughtful. "Sarah." "Yes. I need you to remember something." Whenever Grandma used that tone, I listened carefully, because important lessons usually followed. People will disappoint you." I nodded. That wasn't exactly breaking news. Life had already taught me that. Sometimes they'll betray you. Another truth. A painful one. But that's not the important part. I waited. She turned toward me. Those familiar blue eyes remained as steady as ever. "The important part is what you do afterward." I didn't say anything. I wanted to hear every word. You can become angry. You can become cynical. You can spend the rest of your life trying to hurt people who hurt you." She paused. "Many people do." The evening breeze rustled the trees. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Then she reached over and squeezed my hand, the same way she had done on the day I found her crying. Only now there were no tears, no fear, no pain, just wisdom. "Don't become like them." The words landed gently, but powerfully. "Even when people deserve it?" I asked. She smiled. "Especially then." I thought about my parents, about Uncle Ray, about the family meeting, about all the anger I had carried that day. And suddenly I understood what she meant. Justice mattered. Truth mattered. Accountability mattered. But becoming cruel in pursuit of those things came with a cost. A very high cost. One Grandma had refused to pay. "Character," she said quietly, "is what you choose when you're hurt." I knew immediately that I would remember that sentence for the rest of my life. 3 months later, Margaret Mitchell passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 79 years old. Her funeral filled the church. Veterans, neighbors, friends, community leaders, former patients, military families, people from every chapter of her remarkable life. Some traveled hundreds of miles to attend. Others stood outside because there wasn't enough room inside. I had never seen anything like it. During the service, story after story was shared. Stories of kindness, stories of sacrifice, stories of courage, stories of service. And as I listened, I realized something. The greatest thing Grandma left behind wasn't her house. It wasn't her savings. It wasn't even the foundation. It was the example she set. A life built on dignity, responsibility, compassion, and grace. Today the foundation continues its work. My father still volunteers. My mother still delivers meals. Uncle Ray still complains. And still shows up. The family isn't perfect. Never will be. But we're better than we were. Because one extraordinary woman refused to answer betrayal with hatred. If there's one lesson I carried from my grandmother's life, it's this. You cannot control how people treat you. You cannot control their choices. You cannot control their failures. But you can control who you become because of them. And sometimes the strongest victory isn't making people suffer. It's refusing to lose your character while seeking justice. If Margaret Mitchell's story touched you, take a moment to think about someone who shaped your life through kindness, sacrifice, or quiet strength. Maybe give them a call. Maybe thank them while you still can. And if this story reminded you of someone special, feel free to share it with others who might appreciate its message. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thank you for helping keep stories like my grandmother's alive. The moment the room went quiet, I knew my younger sister's marriage was hanging by a thread. My brother-in-law Trevor still had half a grin on his face like he thought the whole thing was a joke. Across the Thanksgiving table, his father, a retired Marine colonel with silver hair and hands thick from decades of service, was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost walk through the front door. "Boy," he said slowly. Not loudly, not angrily. Worse. The kind of voice older military men use when they already know someone has crossed a line they can't uncross. Apologize now. You could hear the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. My sister Denise stopped cutting the pecan pie. One of the grandkids dropped a fork onto the hardwood floor. Trevor blinked twice, confused, like he couldn't understand why the temperature in the room had suddenly fallen 20 degrees. 10 seconds earlier, he'd been laughing at me. Laughing hard. So what, you served coffee on base, right? I remember the smell of turkey and brown sugar glaze hanging in the air when he said it. Everybody around the table had chuckled politely, the kind of laugh families use when they know something is rude but don't want to make things uncomfortable during the holidays. I'd set my glass down carefully. Try again. Trevor smirked wider. Then what did you do in the Navy? And I answered him the same way I might have commented on the weather. Top Gun instructor. That was when his father froze. Not because of the movies, not because of the name itself, but because men like Richard Hayes knew exactly what it took to earn that title. And suddenly, after 40 years of being invisible in my own family, everybody at that table was looking at me differently. Funny how fast people can rearrange their opinion of you once they realize you were never weak to begin with. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old, retired Navy, and until that Thanksgiving dinner in Northern Virginia, most of my family thought I'd spent my military career pushing paperwork behind a desk somewhere. Honestly, I'd let them think it. It was easier that way. The trouble with accomplishments is that people often treat them like ownership. The minute relatives discover you've done something difficult, they rewrite history. Suddenly they supported you all along. Suddenly they always believed in you. But that wasn't how my story went. I drove to Denise's house that Thanksgiving through cold November rain with an overnight bag in the trunk and every intention of keeping my head down for 48 hours. Her subdivision looked like every upper-middle-class neighborhood built outside Washington during the late 90s, brick homes, trimmed lawns, SUVs lined neatly along curbs. The kind of place where people talked about service more than sacrifice. Denise greeted me warmly enough at the front door, though there was always a stiffness between us that neither of us knew how to fix anymore. Evie, she said, hugging me lightly, long drive. About 4 hours. You should have flown. I almost smiled at that. After 30 years around military aviation, commercial flying had become the one thing I avoided whenever possible. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon candles and roasted turkey. Football played softly from the living room television, while grandchildren raced through the hallway wearing paper turkey hats they'd made at school. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like visiting a version of America I'd spent my life protecting but never quite belonging to. Trevor stood near the kitchen island holding a beer bottle. Big man. Loud personality. The kind who filled silence because he couldn't tolerate it. Hey, he called when he saw me. Denise's mysterious sister finally made it. Mysterious, I asked. Well, sure, he laughed. 30 years in the military and nobody knows what you actually did. I took off my coat slowly. Most people never asked. Richard Hayes was sitting quietly near the fireplace when I walked in. Straight posture despite being well into his 70s. One glance told me everything I needed to know about him, old-school Marine Korea veteran father, probably Vietnam himself. Men like him recognized military habits the way musicians recognize rhythm. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Respectful. Observant. Not performative. That was the first moment all evening I relaxed. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. Denise had gone all-out sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from an actual recipe instead of a can. The grandchildren argued over whipped cream, while Trevor dominated every conversation within reach. He talked about real estate investments, gas prices, politics, how nobody wants to work anymore. I mostly listened. That's another habit the Navy teaches you. Quiet people hear everything. At some point, the conversation turned toward military service after one of the boys asked whether I'd ever been in a dogfight like Maverick. Trevor laughed before I could answer. Oh, come on, he said. Your Aunt Evelyn wasn't flying fighter jets. I shrugged lightly. Why not? Because you're too calm. The table laughed. I did too, a little. Not because it was funny. Because most people think dangerous people look dangerous. Truth is, the deadliest men and women I ever met usually sounded like accountants. Trevor leaned back in his chair. So what, you served coffee on base, right? And there it was. Not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just disrespectful enough to establish a pecking order. I saw Denise tense immediately. She knew her husband's mouth could outrun his judgment sometimes. I set my water glass down. "Try again." He grinned. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I looked directly at him. "Top Gun instructor." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives when a room suddenly realizes it misunderstood someone completely. Richard Hayes stopped moving altogether. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. Then he asked the question nobody else in the room understood enough to ask. "Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program." I nodded once. His expression changed immediately. Not excitement. Recognition. The grandchildren looked confused while Trevor laughed nervously. "Wait, seriously." Richard never took his eyes off me. "Boy," he said quietly. Trevor turned toward his father. "Apologize now." Trevor blinked. "Dad, I was kidding." "No," Richard replied. "You were disrespecting somebody who earned more respect by breakfast than you've earned in your whole life. You could have carved the tension with a butter knife." Denise stared at me like she was meeting me for the first time. And the strange thing was, maybe she was. Richard Hayes followed me into the kitchen about 20 minutes later, while the rest of the family pretended to watch football in the living room. That's the thing about uncomfortable family moments. Nobody ever addresses them directly at first. Americans my age were raised to smooth things over quietly, even when the floorboards underneath the family were cracking. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Denise hovered nearby pretending to organize leftovers. Every few seconds she glanced toward me, then away again. Like she wanted to ask something but didn't know where to begin. Richard stopped beside the counter. "You flew Tomcats?" he asked softly. I nodded once at first. "And later?" "Super Hornets." He let out a low whistle under his breath. Not dramatic. Just honest admiration from one old military soul to another. "You must have caught the tail end of Cold War training." "Barely." He folded his arms. Women weren't exactly welcomed into that pipeline back then. "No," I said, "we weren't." Denise finally turned around. "Wait," she said carefully. "You actually flew combat aircraft?" I dried my hands with a towel before answering. "Yes." The room behind us had gone quieter. Trevor was still in there, but now the television volume had magically dropped low enough for everyone to overhear. Families are funny that way. Suddenly I could feel 40 years of assumptions shifting around inside that house like furniture being rearranged. Denise leaned against the counter. "You never told us any of this." I looked at her for a moment. "You never asked." That landed harder than I intended. Her face softened, immediately hurt, mixing with guilt. And right then I almost regretted saying it. Almost. Because the truth was my family stopped being curious about me a very long time ago. Back when we were girls growing up in Ohio, Denise was sunlight. Blonde hair, easy smile, cheerleader ribbons hanging from her bedroom mirror. Everybody loved Denise because Denise made life simple. I was the difficult one. The quiet one. The girl lying on the garage roof at night memorizing aircraft silhouettes while other girls passed notes about boys. Our father used to shake his head every time I brought home another aviation magazine from the library. "You ought to focus on something practical," he'd tell me. Flying is practical. For a man. Richard pulled a chair out slowly and sat down at the kitchen table. "You mind if I ask what your call sign was?" That got Denise's attention immediately. "Call sign," she repeated. I smiled faintly despite myself. Military families understood what that meant. Civilian families usually thought it was something Hollywood invented. I hesitated. Richard noticed. "If it's classified, forget I asked." "It's not classified," I said quietly, "just old." He waited. I looked down at the dish towel in my hands. Iron Widow. For a second, Richard didn't move. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and muttered one quiet word under his breath. "Jesus." From the living room came Trevor's voice. "What does that mean?" Richard looked toward him. "It means your Aunt Evelyn trained fighter pilots during some very dangerous years. I still don't get why everybody's acting like she landed on the moon. That did it." Richard stood so fast his chair scraped hard across the tile floor. "Because people died learning those skills," he snapped. The whole house went silent again. Trevor stared at his father in shock. I could tell this wasn't how their family normally operated. Richard probably wasn't a man who raised his voice often. Which meant when he did, it mattered. He pointed toward Trevor. You think military aviation is some kind of joke? You think instructors are glorified babysitters? Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Dad, I said I was kidding. No, Richard replied sharply. You were mocking somebody because you assumed she was small enough to mock. Denise stepped between them gently. Okay, she said softly. Everybody calm down. I hated the direction things were going. Not because Trevor didn't deserve embarrassment. Because public humiliation rarely changes people for the better. It just makes them defensive. I'm not upset, I said. Trevor looked at me suspiciously. Then why didn't you tell anyone who you were? That question hung in the kitchen longer than the others had. Why didn't I? The answer wasn't simple. Because when I graduated near the top of flight school, my father said they were lowering standards. Because when I made instructor, one uncle joked I was probably sleeping with admirals. Because when I missed holidays due to deployments, relatives called me selfish for choosing career over family. After enough years, silence becomes easier than self-defense. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from Richard. You know what happens when people hear words like Top Gun? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. They stop seeing you as a person. The kitchen clock ticked softly. They either worship you or resent you, sometimes both. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. Trevor still looked unconvinced, but less arrogant now. More uncertain. Like he was trying to recalculate the entire evening in his head. Denise sat beside me carefully. I honestly thought you worked logistics or administration. I did some of that too. But why never correct us? I gave a tired little shrug. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered because everybody knew the answer. Probably not. The grandchildren wandered halfway into the kitchen, then sensing tension but too young to understand it. Denise's youngest granddaughter looked up at me curiously. Did you really fly jets? I smiled at her. Yes. Were you scared? That question made Richard glance toward me again. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not whether I was important. Not whether I was impressive. Whether I was afraid. All the time I told her honestly. The child frowned. Then why'd you do it? I thought about all the funerals. All the folded flags. All the young pilots pretending bravery before missions. And all the instructors like me who carried the burden of preparing them. Because being scared doesn't mean you quit, I said. The little girl considered that seriously before nodding. Children understand courage better than adults sometimes. Trevor stared down at the kitchen floor for a long moment. Then finally he said the words Richard had been waiting for. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Not polished. Not dramatic. But real enough. And strangely, hearing it didn't make me feel victorious. Just tired. Because apologies arrive quickly at 62 for wounds that began at 16. Later that night, after everyone drifted off toward desserts and coffee, Richard found me alone on the back porch, wrapped in Denise's old wool blanket. Cold rain tapped softly against the deck railing. He stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. You saved lives, didn't you? I kept looking out into the darkness. I trained people, I answered. He nodded slowly. That means yes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Richard asked the question nobody in my family had ever bothered asking before. What did it cost you? And for the first time all evening, I didn't know how to answer. Richard's question stayed with me long after the porch conversation ended. What did it cost you? Funny thing is, younger people usually ask what you achieved. Older people eventually learn to ask what it took. By midnight, the house had gone quiet except for the refrigerator humming in Denise's kitchen and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. I couldn't sleep, so I sat alone at the dining room table with a cup of decaf coffee that tasted weak enough to qualify as punishment. The same table where only hours earlier my brother-in-law had laughed at me. Life turns quickly sometimes. I heard footsteps behind me around 1 a.m. Denise appeared wearing a faded University of Virginia sweatshirt and reading glasses she'd probably deny needing during daylight hours. You always stayed up late, she asked softly. Military habit. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. At 60 years old, my sister still tucked loose hair behind her ear the same nervous way she did at 17. You know, she finally said, when we were kids, I used to tell people you'd become a scientist. I smiled faintly. Why scientist? You were always taking radios apart. That drove Dad crazy. That made her laugh quietly. He thought you were going to electrocute yourself. The mention of our father settled heavily between us. He'd been gone nearly 12 years now. Heart attack at 74, sudden, quick, the kind of death people call merciful because they don't know what else to say. I stared down into my coffee. He never forgave me for joining the Navy. Denise looked uncomfortable immediately. He was old-fashioned. No, I said gently, he was disappointed. There's a difference. People from our parents' generation had very fixed ideas about what daughters were supposed to become. Teachers, nurses, secretaries, wives. Safe. Understandable. I was none of those things. Even at 12 years old, I knew ordinary life would suffocate me. While Denise played house with dolls, I memorized aircraft engines from library books. While other girls hung posters of rock stars, I taped photographs of F-14 Tomcats to my bedroom wall. Dad hated those posters. Looks ridiculous, he'd mutter whenever relatives visited. Mom tried harder to understand me, but even she seemed exhausted by the effort sometimes. You don't always have to prove something, she told me once. The trouble was, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Flying simply felt like the first honest thing I'd ever loved. Denise stirred cream into her coffee slowly. Were you really the only woman in your training class? Not the only one, I said. Just one of very few. And the men gave you trouble. I let out a dry laugh. That's one way to phrase it. She looked genuinely curious now, maybe for the first time in our lives. So I told her, not everything. Some stories stay buried for a reason. But enough. I told her about flight school in Pensacola during the early 80s, about instructors who assumed women would wash out within weeks, about classmates who stopped talking when I entered briefing rooms, about the exhaustion. God, the exhaustion. People imagine military aviation as glamorous because of movies. They picture leather jackets and triumphant music. Reality is fluorescent lighting at 4 in the morning while someone twice your size critiques every mistake you make. Reality is studying until your eyes blur because one error in the sky can kill people. Reality is understanding that if you fail, some men will use your failure as evidence women never belonged there in the first place. Denise listened without interrupting. That sounds miserable. Some of it was. Then why stay? I thought about that carefully. Because quitting would have followed me forever. Because every cruel comment fueled me instead of stopping me. Because once I sat inside a fighter jet for the first time and felt those engines wake beneath me, there was no going back to ordinary life. You know what the strange part was, I said quietly. What? The sky was the easy part. Denise frowned slightly. People were harder. That seemed to hit her. Maybe because she realized she'd been part of that without meaning to. Growing up, Denise had always been the easy daughter to love. She married young, had children, hosted Christmas dinners, remembered birthdays. Meanwhile, I missed funerals because of deployments and forgot anniversaries because I lived by military calendars instead of civilian ones. Families forgive warmth more easily than absence. You know, Dad used to brag about you eventually, Denise said suddenly. I looked up sharply. He did. Not publicly, she smiled sadly. Only when his friends weren't around. That hurt more than I expected. All those years I'd thought he was ashamed of me completely. Denise stared into her coffee. I think he just didn't know how to understand you. That's not the same thing as trying. No, she admitted quietly, it's not. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. Outside cold rain drifted against the windows. You really never married because of the Navy, Denise asked. I smiled a little. That's the simplified version. There had been men. A few good ones. One almost became my husband back in 1989, naval aviator named Scott Brennan, smart, kind, loved jazz music and terrible diner coffee. He died during a training accident over the Atlantic 3 months before the wedding. After that, I stopped imagining permanent things. Denise covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. I'm all right. But even saying those words after 30 years still carried weight. The military teaches you to continue functioning after loss. It does not teach you how to stop carrying it." I had no idea she whispered. Most people didn't. That was the pattern of my life, really. Invisible sacrifices, invisible grief, invisible service. And maybe that's why Trevor's joke hit harder than he realized. Not because it insulted my rank, because it erased decades of sacrifice with one careless sentence. Denise reached across the table slowly and touched my hand. "I'm sorry too," she said. Simple words. Late words. But sincere. I squeezed her hand gently. "You were living your life," I told her. "So were you." "Yes." She looked at me carefully then. "And were you happy?" That question caught me off guard. Because accomplishment and happiness are not always neighbors. I thought about roaring engines at sunrise, young pilots graduating under my instruction, lonely apartments near bases scattered across America. I thought about funerals, missed holidays, silence. Then I answered honestly, "Sometimes." Denise nodded like she understood more than she wanted to. And maybe she did. By morning, nothing in that house had fully healed. But for the first time in decades, the truth had finally entered the room. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. Some routines never leave you even after retirement. For 30 years my life had been measured by alarms in dark rooms, briefing schedules, flight plans, weather reports, and the sound of boots against concrete before dawn. Civilian life still felt slightly unnatural to me sometimes, like I was borrowing someone else's rhythm. Denise's house was quiet when I walked downstairs wearing jeans and an old navy sweatshirt faded nearly gray with age. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt coffee from the automatic timer machine sputtering on the counter. Richard Hayes was already awake. Of course he was. Old Marines rarely sleep late. He sat alone at the table reading a newspaper with the posture of a man who still expected inspection at any moment. He looked up when I entered. "Mornin', Commander." I smiled slightly. "Retired, Commander?" "Still counts." He folded the paper carefully. "Coffee." "I've survived worse." That earned the first real laugh I'd heard from him. I poured myself a mug and sat across from him while soft November light crept through the kitchen windows. For a while we simply existed in companionable silence. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. We don't rush to fill every empty space anymore. Finally Richard spoke. "You know Trevor's embarrassed. He'll survive. He's not a bad man." I didn't say he was. And I meant that. Trevor wasn't cruel at his core. Loud, insecure, thoughtless, sometimes yes, but not malicious. Men like Trevor often mistake confidence for volume because nobody ever taught them the difference. Richard rubbed one rough hand along his jaw. He grew up around stories about military service, he said, but stories and sacrifice aren't the same thing. Number. He thinks respecting veterans means bumper stickers and flag pins. I took a sip of coffee. A lot of Americans do. Richard studied me for a long moment. "You're angry?" That surprised me. Not because he noticed. Because I hadn't admitted it to myself until then. I looked down into the coffee mug. "Yes," I said quietly. "About Trevor." I shook my head slowly. "About how easy it was." He frowned slightly. "What was?" "For everyone to assume I couldn't possibly have done something difficult." The words came out calmer than I felt. That assumption follows women your whole life, especially women my age. I gave a small shrug. People see gray hair and politeness and suddenly decide you were never dangerous. Richard nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. "You know," he said, "when I first saw you walk in yesterday, I noticed your posture immediately. That's hard to get rid of." "No," he replied, "but it told me something." I smiled faintly, that I spent too many years standing inspections. That you carried responsibility. Outside, rainwater dripped softly from the gutters. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I heard stories about Iron Widow years ago." That old call sign still felt strange in civilian conversation. Most military nicknames sound ridiculous outside their original context. "What kind of stories?" I asked. "That pilots cried after your evaluations." I laughed quietly into my coffee. "Some did. And then they got better." Richard grinned. "That's what I heard." I stared out the window for a moment, remembering. Young faces. Nervous hands. Cocky lieutenants pretending confidence before carrier qualifications. Kids, really. Most of them barely old enough to rent cars carrying machines worth millions of dollars onto pitching flight decks in darkness. People romanticize military aviation because they never see the fear. I saw it every day. That was my job. You know why instructors get hard? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head once. Because eventually you realize kindness can kill people. The kitchen went still. I continued carefully. If a pilot freezes during training, you correct it. If they get sloppy, you correct it. If they panic under pressure, you force them through it again and again until instinct replaces fear. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Because one day they'll need it for real. Yes. I stared down at my hands. And sometimes they still don't come home. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. There are certain truths veterans recognize without elaboration. Loss is one of them. Around 8 o'clock, the rest of the household slowly came alive upstairs. Footsteps, running water, cabinet doors opening. Then Trevor entered the kitchen. The confidence from yesterday was gone. Good. Embarrassment can be healthy if it teaches humility. He stood awkwardly near the doorway for a second before looking at me. Morning. Morning. Richard quietly folded his newspaper and stood. I'm gonna check the weather outside. The old Marine was giving us privacy. Subtle. Respectful. Trevor sat across from me after his father left. For a moment he looked younger somehow, less polished, less certain. My dad chewed me out for an hour last night, he admitted. I figured. He said I embarrassed myself. I sipped coffee calmly. Did you? He let out a breath through his nose. Probably. That was progress. He rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly thought you were exaggerating. Most people do. No, I mean... He hesitated. You just don't act like someone important. I almost laughed. There it was again. The misunderstanding. What does someone important act like, I asked. Trevor opened his mouth. Closed it again. Exactly. He looked embarrassed. I guess I expected... He searched for words. More ego. That's television, I said. He nodded slowly. Then after a pause, he asked something unexpected. Did people give you hell because you were a woman? I leaned back slightly. Constantly. He looked genuinely disturbed by that. Even after you proved yourself. Especially then. That seemed to shake him. I think for the first time in his life, Trevor realized competence doesn't protect people from prejudice. Sometimes it attracts more of it. He stared down at the kitchen table. My daughter wants to join the Air Force someday. I smiled faintly. Then teach her not to shrink herself for insecure men. He looked up sharply. Not defensive this time. Thoughtful. And suddenly I saw what Richard had probably been hoping for all along. Not punishment. Growth. Denise entered the kitchen carrying laundry a few minutes later and stopped short when she saw us talking peacefully. Well, she said carefully, this is less terrifying than yesterday. Trevor snorted softly. Low bar. She looked at me uncertainly. You okay? I nodded. Yes. And strangely enough, for the first time since arriving, I actually meant it. That afternoon, Denise insisted everybody take a walk after lunch. Fresh air will stop this family from killing each other, she announced. Nobody argued. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean and smelling faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Northern Virginia in late November always reminded me of old photographs, gray skies, bare trees, and people pretending winter wasn't already waiting around the corner. The grandchildren raced ahead down the sidewalk while the adults followed more slowly in pairs. Trevor walked beside me after a while, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. You know, he said carefully, I looked you up last night. I glanced sideways at him. That dangerous, huh? He gave a nervous laugh. My dad said if I was going to open my mouth about military service, maybe I should educate myself first. Wise man. Trevor nodded. I found articles. That didn't surprise me much. Retirement ceremonies, defense newsletters, aviation publications. Bits and pieces of a career scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs. Most people simply never connected those stories to the quiet woman bringing cranberry sauce to Thanksgiving dinner. What kind of articles, I asked. One about carrier training. He hesitated. Another mentioned you received some kind of commendation after an accident investigation. I looked ahead toward the children. That was years ago. What happened? The memory arrived instantly. Heat. Smoke. A young pilot screaming into a radio. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Mechanical failure during training exercises. Trevor waited. The pilot survived. But barely. He nodded quietly. That was another thing civilians sometimes misunderstood about military life. Survival was not the same thing as escaping unharmed. We walked another 20 feet before Trevor spoke again. My dad said instructors carry guilt for people who die. I stopped walking for a second. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in cold wind. Yes, I said softly. Trevor's expression shifted immediately, like he realized he'd stumbled onto something heavier than curiosity. I'm sorry, he said quickly. You don't have to apologize for asking. But I appreciated that he cared enough to hesitate. That mattered. We kept walking. Across the street, someone had already put up Christmas lights, even though Thanksgiving wasn't over yet. Red and green reflections shimmered faintly against wet pavement. Trevor glanced toward the grandchildren. Did you lose students? There it was. The real question. I kept my eyes forward. Yes. His face tightened. How many? I stopped counting. That answer silenced him completely. Not because the number shocked him, because he finally understood there was one. People over 60 know something younger people often don't. The older you get, the less impressive glory becomes and the more meaningful endurance feels. Trevor had spent years admiring military imagery. Flags, jets, uniforms. But now he was beginning to see the human cost underneath the symbolism. We returned to the house about half an hour later. Denise started preparing sandwiches while football commentators shouted from the television. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs with tablets and blankets. Ordinary American family life? And somehow that normalcy made the conversation feel even heavier. Richard found me later in the den studying old framed family photos on the bookshelf. You were 21 there, he said, pointing toward a picture of me in dress whites. 22. You looked angry. I was. He laughed quietly. Fair enough. I picked up the frame carefully. That photograph had been taken the day I completed advanced flight training. My father had attended the ceremony wearing a stiff gray suit and the expression of a man pretending support because public embarrassment would look worse. You know what he said afterward, I asked. Richard shook his head. He told me maybe now I'd grow out of this phase. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Christ. I think he genuinely believed military service would eventually make me softer somehow. I smiled faintly. Instead, it made me harder. Richard leaned against the bookshelf. Hard isn't always bad. No, I admitted, but it gets lonely. That word hung between us. Lonely. There it was. Not heroic. Not cinematic. Just true. People imagine loneliness as empty apartments and quiet nights. But the deepest loneliness comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by people who've known you your whole life. Denise entered the room carrying folded towels. You two look serious again. We're old, Richard replied. It's our favorite hobby. She smiled before sitting beside me on the couch. I've been thinking about something, she said carefully. That sounds dangerous. She nudged my shoulder lightly. I mean it. I looked at her. When Mom got sick, Denise hesitated. Why didn't you come sooner? Ah, that wound. The hardest ones are always family questions asked 20 years too late. I was deployed, I answered quietly. You came eventually. Yes, but not until the end. There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made it worse. I stared at the family photo in my hands. The Navy denied my leave twice. Denise blinked. What? We were short pilots. Her face fell completely. You never told me that. What good would it have done? You could have explained. I gave a tired smile. To who, Dad? The relatives already calling me selfish. Denise looked down at her hands. Because she remembered. The whispers during Mom's final weeks. Poor Margaret. One daughter here every day, the other chasing airplanes. Funny how people build entire moral judgments around information they never bothered verifying. I thought you chose not to come, Denise whispered. No, I said gently. I chose not to defend myself anymore. The room went quiet. Richard looked angry now, though not at me. You carried that alone. I shrugged. Military families do it all the time. Denise's eyes filled with tears. Oh God, Evie. I touched her arm softly before she could spiral into guilt. You loved Mom, I said. That mattered more than misunderstandings. But you loved her too. Yes? And there it was again. The truth nobody had ever fully seen. I had sacrificed family moments for service. But I had also sacrificed service for family every chance I could. And somehow still ended up disappointing both worlds sometimes. Trevor appeared quietly in the doorway then. He looked hesitant, like a man realizing the story he mocked was much bigger than his pride. I owe you more than an apology, he said carefully. I looked at him calmly. Maybe. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, I think I owe you respect. That one felt different. Because respect offered voluntarily means something. Especially from a man finally learning humility. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Richard Hayes called me on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing tools in my garage. Retirement does strange things to people. After decades of operating at high speed, you suddenly find yourself spending 30 minutes deciding where to hang a wrench. Evelyn Richards said over the phone, "You busy Saturday night?" I had plans to aggressively avoid social interaction. He laughed. I'm serious. So am I. That old Marine chuckled again before his tone softened. I'd like you to come to the Veterans Relief Gala. I leaned against the workbench. Richard, hear me out first. I already knew the event he meant. Annual fundraiser outside Arlington for veteran families, military widows, and disabled service members. The kind of formal gathering filled with donated wine, patriotic speeches, and retired officers pretending not to compare ribbons. Not exactly my natural habitat anymore. You'd hate it, he admitted honestly, which is why I know you're the right person to invite. That logic feels questionable. I'm old, humor me. I sighed. Why me? The line went quiet for a second. Because too many loud people get celebrated these days, he said. I'd rather honor someone who actually carried weight. That answer sat heavily in my chest. Nobody had ever spoken about my career that way before. Not publicly. Not personally. After we hung up, I stood alone in the garage for a long time, staring at dust floating through cold morning sunlight. Then eventually I whispered the same thing I'd whispered before difficult flights for 30 years. All right. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. I wore a simple black dress with a navy blazer instead of formal military attire. My dress uniform still hung preserved in garment bags upstairs, but I had no interest in becoming a walking museum exhibit for one evening. The gala was held at an old hotel ballroom overlooking the Potomac. Warm lights glowed against polished wood floors, while a jazz trio played softly near the entrance. Mostly older crowd. Gray hair. Slow steps. Veterans. Widows. Children of service members. People who understood sacrifice without needing it explained dramatically. I spotted Denise first near the registration table. She hugged me tightly the moment I walked in. You look beautiful, she said. You look nervous. I am nervous. Why? She smiled weakly. Because Richard refuses to tell me what he's planning. That worried me immediately. Oh no. Before she could answer, Trevor approached from across the room wearing a dark suit and the uncomfortable expression of a man attending his own sentencing hearing. Hey, he said carefully. Hey. He shoved his hands into his pockets. I just wanted to say, thanks for coming. That bad, huh? He actually smiled a little. You have no idea. Richard finally appeared near the ballroom entrance wearing a Marine Corps blazer that somehow made him stand straighter than men 20 years younger. When he saw me, his face softened warmly. There she is. Richard I warned immediately, if this evening includes public embarrassment, I'm stealing your cane. You wouldn't dare. I flew tactical aircraft off moving ships. Test me. That made him laugh hard enough to cough. The evening itself began quietly enough. Dinner, speeches, charity auctions, stories about military families holding themselves together through deployments and grief and impossible years. Real stories. Not Hollywood nonsense. At some point during dessert, Richard stepped onto the small stage near the ballroom windows and tapped the microphone gently. The room settled. "I know everybody's tired of old men talking," he began, "but indulge me a few minutes more." Polite laughter rolled through the ballroom. Richard looked directly toward me. "Most military celebrations focus on visible leadership," he said. "Decorated commanders, public heroes, the names people recognize." His voice grew quieter. "But some of the most important people in military history are almost completely unknown outside the people they trained." My stomach dropped immediately. "Oh, Richard. You sneaky old Marine." Across the room, Trevor gave me an apologetic look, like he suddenly realized what was happening too late to stop it. Richard continued calmly. "Several weeks ago during Thanksgiving dinner, my son embarrassed himself by mocking a woman who spent decades quietly serving this country." Now the ballroom had gone fully silent. I considered climbing out a nearby window. "She never asked for recognition," Richard said, "which is exactly why she deserves it." Then he looked directly at me. "Commander Evelyn Carter, would you stand, please?" God help me. Slowly, reluctantly, I stood. And then something unexpected happened. Several older men across the ballroom straightened immediately. One man near the back whispered "Iron Widow" under his breath. Another veteran stood up first. Then another. And another. Not applause at first. Recognition. The kind earned quietly over years. A retired pilot near the stage approached me slowly with tears already gathering in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me," he said. I looked carefully at his face. Older now, gray-haired, heavy around the shoulders. But familiar. "Danny Ruiz," I said softly. His laugh broke halfway into a sob. "Jesus Christ, you really do remember." "I remember every pilot who almost killed my blood pressure." The room laughed warmly. Danny wiped his eyes quickly. "You failed me twice during carrier qualification. You were reckless. You saved my life." The ballroom went still again. Danny looked around the room before continuing. "I was 24 years old and thought confidence mattered more than discipline." He swallowed hard. 2 years later, combat hit, and every correction she drilled into me kept me alive. Nobody spoke. Because there are moments older Americans recognize instinctively as sacred. Truth was one of them. Danny looked at me again. "You taught us how to come home." I honestly didn't know what to say to that. After all those years, all those funerals, all those lonely nights wondering whether any of it mattered. Suddenly the weight felt visible. Trevor stepped forward then, his face pale, voice unsteady. "I need to say something too." The room turned toward him. He looked directly at me. "A few weeks ago I made fun of someone because I judged her before understanding her." He swallowed hard. "Truth is, I felt insecure around things I didn't understand." Nobody moved. Trevor took a breath. "I thought being loud made me important." His eyes dropped briefly. I was wrong. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I believed him. The drive home from the gala felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not dramatic. Just quiet. At my age, I'd learned that real closure rarely arrives with fireworks. Most healing enters softly like evening light through old curtains. The highway south was nearly empty. Christmas lights glowed from distant neighborhoods, while old holiday songs drifted through the radio low enough not to interrupt my thoughts. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And oddly enough, that realization hurt a little. Because once people finally saw me clearly, I couldn't stop wondering how different life might have been if they'd bothered sooner. A few days later, Denise called asking if I'd come for Christmas. Not out of obligation. Not because Richard insisted. Because she wanted me there. That distinction mattered. "I don't want you staying at a hotel this time," she said firmly over the phone. "You're family." Family. Such a simple word for something so complicated. I arrived Christmas Eve carrying a pecan pie from a roadside bakery and fully expecting awkwardness. Instead, Trevor opened the front door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "I'm on biscuit duty," he announced solemnly. "Pray for everyone." I laughed before I could stop myself. And just like that, something shifted. Not erased. Not magically repaired. But softened. The grandchildren swarmed the living room floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and battery-operated chaos. Denise had decorated the house with old-fashioned colored lights instead of the blinding white ones everyone uses now. The whole place felt warmer. More honest somehow. Richard sat near the fireplace wearing a thick cardigan and reading glasses while pretending not to supervise everybody. "You're late," he grumbled as I walked in. "I was avoiding your cooking." "That was one time. One traumatic time." He pointed a crooked finger at me. "Still disrespectful." The family laughed. And hearing myself inside that laughter instead of outside, it felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Later that evening after dinner, dishes were stacked, and the grandchildren disappeared upstairs with new toys. Trevor handed me a glass of wine and motioned toward the back porch. Cold winter air greeted us outside. The neighborhood glowed softly beneath Christmas lights and quiet suburban darkness. Trevor leaned against the railing. "You know," he said, "I used to think confidence meant always having something to say." I smiled faintly. "That explains a lot." He laughed softly. "Fair." For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant wind moving through bare trees. Then his expression grew serious again. "I owe you another apology." "Trevor." "No, listen." His voice carried none of the defensiveness from Thanksgiving. Only honesty. "I spent years teaching my son to respect veterans." He shook his head slowly. "But I never realized respect also means shutting up long enough to learn who people really are." That one landed deep. Because it wasn't just about military service anymore. It was about life. About aging. About how many older Americans quietly carry histories nobody around them ever notices. I looked out across the neighborhood. "When you get older," I said softly, "people start assuming your story is already finished." Trevor nodded slowly. "But it's not." "Number?" He glanced toward me carefully. "You ever regret it?" "The Navy." "Everything." That question deserved honesty. I thought about Scott Brennan. Carrier decks at sunrise. Lonely apartments. Missed funerals. Young pilots surviving because of lessons I screamed into them during training. I thought about my father dying before truly understanding me. And Denise finally trying. I regret some costs, I admitted quietly, but not the service. Trevor looked relieved by that answer for reasons I couldn't entirely understand. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly through the windows. Warm. Human. Temporary. The older you get, the more you treasure temporary things. When we returned inside, Richard waved me toward the dining table where his grandson Luke sat hunched over a model airplane kit. The boy looked up nervously. "Aunt Evelyn?" he asked. "Yes." His cheeks reddened slightly. "Mom says you flew fighter jets." "I did." He hesitated. "I want to fly someday too." Trevor immediately opened his mouth, then stopped himself. "Growth." I hid a smile. "What kind of flying?" I asked Luke. "Air Force, maybe." He glanced at the little plastic airplane in his hands, or Navy. I pulled out a chair beside him. "Then learn humility early." He blinked. "That's the secret." "One of them." I pointed gently toward the unfinished model airplane. "Machines don't care about ego. The sky doesn't either." Luke listened carefully the way children do when they know an adult is finally giving them the real answer instead of a polished one. "You know what makes people dangerous?" I asked. He shook his head. "Thinking they're too smart to learn." Across the room, Richard smiled quietly into his coffee. The evening slowed after that. Old movies on television. Half-asleep grandchildren under blankets. Denise humming softly in the kitchen while wrapping leftovers in foil. Ordinary moments. And somehow, after a lifetime of extraordinary pressure and responsibility, ordinary finally felt precious. Before bed, I found myself alone at the kitchen sink washing dishes while snow began falling lightly outside the window. Denise walked in carrying another stack of plates. "You don't have to do those," she said. "I know." She stood beside me drying dishes quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I used to think your life was sad." I looked at her gently. "And now?" She smiled through tears gathering in her eyes. "I think it was brave." That nearly broke me. Not because I needed praise, because after 62 years, my sister finally saw me clearly. And maybe that's all most people really want before the end of their story. To be seen truthfully. Not perfectly. Just truthfully. If this story reminded you of someone whose sacrifices went unnoticed for too long, maybe reach out to them while you still can. Sometimes respect arrives late, but it still matters when it comes from the heart. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be remembered too, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this. The groom hit the floor before anyone realized something was wrong. One moment he was laughing, a glass of champagne lifted halfway to his lips, the string quartet drifting softly through the hall, and the next his body folded in on itself like a man whose strings had been cut. The glass shattered against the polished marble. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped back. Someone shouted his name again and again as if repetition alone could pull him back from wherever he had just gone. I was standing 10 feet away holding a tray I didn't remember picking up. For a second no one moved. Then everyone did. People rushed in, crowding him, kneeling, hovering, talking over each other. Someone tried to lift his shoulders. Someone else fumbled with their phone calling for help but not saying anything useful. I saw his face gray already, lips tinged blue, and something inside me shifted into a place I hadn't visited in years. I stepped forward. "Back off, you're just a dishwasher." The words hit hard enough to stop me for half a heartbeat. I didn't look up to see who said it. I didn't need to. I had heard versions of that sentence before, different words, same meaning. Not qualified, not wanted, not anymore. They weren't wrong. But his breathing was wrong. I set the tray down somewhere, I think, and dropped to my knees beside him. "Move," I said quietly. Not loud, not commanding, just certain. No one listened at first. Not until I reached for his jaw and tilted his head back, checking his airway with hands that remembered more than I allowed myself to. Then a voice behind me cut through the noise. "Give her space." It wasn't loud either, but it carried weight. People shifted, reluctantly, just enough. I pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "Pulse irregular, weak." "Call 911 again," I said. "Tell them he's not breathing right." "I already did," someone snapped. "Then stay on the line," I said. I leaned closer, listening to his chest. The rhythm wasn't just off, it was collapsing into itself. I could feel it even without the monitors, without the machines, without the sterile brightness of an operating room. For a moment, just a moment, I hesitated. Because I wasn't supposed to do this anymore. Because the last time I had it had cost me everything. "Are you even trained for this?" another voice demanded. I ignored it. I adjusted his position, cleared his airway, counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. A memory flashed uninvited. Bright lights. The steady beep of a monitor. A younger version of myself standing over a table, hands steady, voice calm. I pushed it away. This wasn't then. This was now. I pressed down on his chest. "Hey, stop." I said, "Back off," I repeated, still calm, still focused. "Unless one of you knows what you're doing." No one answered that. I continued. Compression, breath, compression. The room had gone quieter, though I didn't notice exactly when. The panic had thinned into something else, fear maybe, or waiting. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Oh my God, it's her. I looked up. He was standing just beyond the circle, tall, even with age settling into his shoulders. His suit was dark, formal, the kind worn by men who had spent a lifetime being listened to. But it wasn't the suit that caught my attention. It was his face. Not fear. Recognition. And something else beneath it, something like disbelief. Our eyes met for half a second. Long enough. I looked back down at the groom. "Stay with me," I muttered, though I didn't know if he could hear it. I adjusted my hands, recalibrated pressure. The rhythm shifted slightly under my palms. Not enough. But something... "Ambulance is 2 minutes out," someone called. Good. I kept going. 1, 2, 3. The general stepped closer, his voice lower, now meant only for me. I thought... He didn't finish. Neither did I. There wasn't time. After what felt like too long and not long enough at all, I felt it. A change. Subtle, fragile. But there. I paused just long enough to check again. Pulse faint but present. "Okay," I said quietly, "okay." The room seemed to breathe again with me. Sirens cut through the distance, growing louder. I sat back slightly, not fully letting go, just enough to give space when the paramedics rushed in moments later. They took over quickly, efficiently, their movements sharp and practiced. I answered their questions without thinking. timing, symptoms, what I'd done. They didn't ask who I was. That part didn't matter. Not anymore. As they lifted him onto the stretcher and wheeled him out, the crowd parted again, this time in silence. The celebration had drained out of the room, replaced by something heavier. I stayed on my knees for a second longer than I needed to. Then I stood. My hands were trembling. I hadn't noticed until then. I walked back toward the service corridor without looking at anyone, wiping my palms on my apron out of habit more than anything else. Wait. His voice stopped me. I turned. He was closer now. The general. Close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way time had settled into him without softening him. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I shook my head. It wasn't entirely true. But it was easier. He studied me as if weighing something. Then he nodded once. "I remember you," he said. I didn't answer. What would I have said? Instead, I turned and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. The noise hit me all at once, running water, clattering dishes, voices overlapping in confusion. Someone asked what happened. Someone else said they thought the groom was dead. I moved to the sink. Turned on the faucet. Hot water rushed over my hands. I stood there for a long time, just letting it run. No one asked me anything. Martha glanced at me once from across the room, her expression unreadable, then went back to directing the staff. That was one thing I'd always appreciated about her. She didn't ask questions people weren't ready to answer. I picked up a plate, started scrubbing. Same as before. Same as always. But my hands didn't quite feel the same. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a door I had kept shut for years had opened just a crack. I didn't know if I was ready for what might come through it. I just knew I couldn't close it again. I stayed at the sink long after the last of the guests had drifted out, and the kitchen settled into its usual end-of-night rhythm. Plates came in slower now. Voices dropped. The adrenaline that had filled the air earlier had thinned into something quieter, uneasy, unfinished. No one mentioned what had happened in the ballroom. Not directly. But I could feel it in the way people moved around me. A glance held half a second too long. A question that almost formed, then didn't. Even Martha, who rarely let anything go unaddressed, kept her distance. I was grateful for that. I didn't trust my voice yet. The hot water kept running, steam rising in soft curls that blurred the edges of everything. I scrubbed each plate with more care than necessary, focusing on the small familiar motions. It was easier that way. Easier than thinking about the man on the floor. Easier than thinking about the man who had recognized me. Oh my God, it's her. I dried my hands slowly and turned off the faucet. For a long moment I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the faint clatter of someone stacking chairs out front. Then I went back to work. I used to be a trauma surgeon at a VA hospital outside Dayton. That's the kind of sentence people expect to come with pride, or at least a sense of accomplishment. But when I say it now, it feels more like something I'm reading off a file that no longer belongs to me. Back then, my days started before sunrise and ended long after the sky had gone dark again. I lived on bad coffee and routines that didn't leave much room for anything else. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't meant to be. It was work that mattered. The kind where your decisions didn't just shape outcomes, they defined them. Most of my patients were veterans. Men and women who carried things no chart could fully capture, injuries that were visible, others that weren't. I learned quickly that medicine at that level wasn't just about skill. It was about judgment, timing, and sometimes choices you couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. That's where I met Daniel Mercer. He came in late one night, airlifted from a highway accident outside the city. The report said he'd been hit broadside by a truck that ran a red light. By the time he reached us, his condition had already started to spiral. Internal bleeding, head trauma, compromised airway. Everything at once. I remember the moment they wheeled him in, the way the room shifted, not chaotic focused. Everyone knew their role. Everyone moved with purpose. I took one look at him and knew we didn't have time for hesitation. "Prepper 2, I said. "We're going in now." There's a kind of silence that settles over a surgical team right before things begin. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of doubt. You trust the people around you. You trust your hands. And you push everything else aside. That night, everything worked the way it was supposed to. We stabilized him, controlled the bleeding, repaired what we could, managed what we couldn't. When it was over, he was still alive. Barely but alive. I remember stepping out of the operating room and seeing a man standing in the hallway, tall, straight-backed, not pacing, not fidgeting, just waiting. He looked at me like I had something he needed. He started... He made it through surgery, I told him. The next 24 hours will be critical. He nodded once. No visible relief, just a slight shift in his shoulders. Thank you, he said. I didn't think much of it at the time. We saw families like that every day. What mattered was the patient. Daniel stayed in the ICU for weeks. Complications came and went. Infections, setbacks, small victories that didn't always hold. But he fought. You could see it even when he was unconscious, the way his body resisted giving up. I checked on him whenever I could. Not because he was different. Because he wasn't. He was exactly the kind of patient I had chosen this job for. When he finally regained consciousness, it was quiet. No dramatic moment, no sudden clarity, just a slow return to awareness piece by piece. He didn't remember the accident. That wasn't unusual. What mattered was that he was there. Alive. The day everything changed didn't feel different when it started. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because I had planned to leave early for once. I had even told myself I would go home before midnight. That didn't happen. It never did. Around 8:30 p.m., 2 patients were brought in within minutes of each other. One was Daniel. The other was not. The second patient was older, late 60s, no immediate family present. Cardiac complications layered over an existing condition that had already been declining. Both needed intervention. Both needed resources we didn't have enough of. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Hospitals aren't built for ideal conditions. They're built for reality. And reality means limitations. One operating room was already in use. Another was being prepped. We had 1 ventilator available in the unit. Just 1. I stood there looking at 2 charts that both demanded everything, and knowing I couldn't give it to both. Which one, a resident asked. There are moments in this job when the world narrows down to a single point. This was one of them. Daniel was younger, stronger, more likely to survive aggressive intervention. The other man wasn't. On paper, the decision should have been clear. But paper doesn't always tell the whole story. I made the call. By the time the night ended, 1 patient was stable. The other was gone. I signed the report just before dawn. No hesitation. No explanation beyond what was required. That's what you do. You document, you move on. Or at least that's what I thought. The investigation started 2 weeks later. It moved fast. Faster than anything I had seen before. Questions I wasn't expecting. Conclusions drawn before answers were fully given. A narrative that seemed to take shape without needing much input from me. Medical negligence. Improper allocation of resources. Failure to follow protocol. I read the words over and over again, trying to understand how they fit with what had actually happened. They didn't. But they didn't need to. Someone had to be responsible. And I was the one who had made the decision. I didn't fight it. People have asked me why. Lawyers, reporters, even Martha once in a moment she probably regretted. The answer has never been simple. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was knowing how these things play out. But the biggest part was that I wasn't sure I had the right to defend myself. Not after the choice I had made. I finished the last of the dishes and turned off the lights in the kitchen. The hallway was empty when I stepped out. For a moment I thought I was alone. Then I saw him. Waiting. The general. He didn't say anything right away. Just watched me the way he had in the ballroom, like he was trying to place something that didn't quite fit. You were there, he said finally. It wasn't a question. No, I replied. It came out before I could stop it. A reflex. He held my gaze. You were, he repeated softer now. I shook my head again. And this time I turned and walked past him before he could say anything else. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. The air was cool, quiet. I stood there for a long time, keys in my hand, staring at nothing in particular. Behind me, the building settled into silence. In front of me, the night stretched out the way it always did. Unchanged. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. And I knew whether I wanted to admit it or not that whatever I had left behind all those years ago wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go home right away. The engine was running headlights, cutting a narrow path across the empty lot, but I stayed parked, hands resting on the wheel like I had forgotten what came next. It had been years since anything had followed me out of that hospital, years since anyone had looked at me like they knew who I was before I became someone easier to overlook. You were there. His voice stayed with me longer than I expected. I turned the key, backed out slowly, and drove the long way home. No radio, just the steady hum of the road and the kind of quiet that lets old thoughts rise whether you invite them or not. The next morning started the same as every other. Coffee too weak. Toast I didn't finish. The same worn jacket by the door. I left at the same time, took the same route, and parked in the same spot behind the catering hall. Routine has a way of protecting you. It keeps the past from getting too close. Inside the kitchen was already alive. Pots clanged. Orders were being called out for a luncheon event. Someone laughed too loudly at something that wasn't that funny. Normal. I tied on my apron and went straight to the sink. Martha was at the prep table, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses perched low on her nose as she checked invoices. She looked up once when I walked in. "You all right?" she asked. It wasn't prying, just a simple question. "I'm fine," I said. She held my gaze for a moment longer than usual, then nodded and went back to her paperwork. That was the end of it. Or it should have been. By mid-morning, the deliveries started arriving. Produce crates, boxes of glassware, linens for a church reception scheduled later that afternoon. I moved through it all without thinking, stacking, rinsing, organizing, letting the rhythm of the work settle me. That's when I saw him. Not the general. Someone else. He was standing near the service entrance, just inside the doorway, looking like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. Early 30s, maybe. Clean cut. Still dressed in yesterday's suit, though the tie was gone and the collar had loosened. He looked tired. More than tired. "Can I help you?" one of the servers asked him. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved across the room, searching for something. Or someone. Then they landed on me. For a second, I considered turning away, pretending I hadn't noticed. But it was too late. He started walking over. "Excuse me," he said, stopping a few feet from the sink. "Were you working the Mercer wedding last night?" The name hit harder than I expected. Mercer. I kept my hands in the water. "Yes," I said. "I was told..." He hesitated like he wasn't sure how to phrase it. "I was told you were the one who helped my brother." Brother. Not groom. Not Daniel. Brother? I dried my hands slowly and turned to face him. "He's alive?" I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended. He nodded. "I see you," he said. "They said if you hadn't stepped in when you did..." He trailed off, swallowing whatever came next. He wouldn't have made it to the ambulance. I let that settle. Not relief. Not exactly. Something more complicated. "I'm glad," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You knew what you were doing," he said. "Not a question this time." I didn't answer. "I mean, that wasn't basic first aid," he went on. "The paramedics said..." "You should talk to them," I interrupted gently. "They weren't there yet," he said. I held his gaze. There was something in it I recognized. Not suspicion, not accusation. Gratitude. The kind that doesn't know where to land. "My father wants to speak with you," he added. There it was. I felt my shoulders tighten before I could stop it. "I'm working," I said. "It won't take long." "It usually does," I replied. He frowned, slightly confused. "You don't understand," he said. "He's been asking about you since last night. He thinks he knows you from somewhere." I turned back to the sink. "People think that sometimes," I said. "It's not like that," he insisted. "I can't help him," I said, cutting him off more firmly this time. The words hung between us. He didn't move. "Look," he said after a moment, softer now. "I don't know what happened last night. Not really. But I know what I saw. You saved my brother's life. That matters." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "It doesn't change anything," I said. "Maybe it should," he replied. I shook my head. "No," I said, "it shouldn't." He left a few minutes later. Not angry, not satisfied either. Just uncertain. I watched him go through the reflection in the stainless steel sink, his figure growing smaller as he stepped out into the daylight. For a long time after that, I didn't move. By the time my shift ended, the kitchen had emptied out again. Martha was the last one still there, wiping down the counters with slow, methodical strokes. "You've got company," she said without looking up. I didn't need to ask who. "I'm heading out," she added. "Lock up when you're done." "Okay," I said. She paused, then glanced at me. "You don't have to talk to him," she said. I nodded. "I know. But I also knew something else. Avoiding things doesn't make them disappear. It just delays the moment they catch up." He was waiting outside this time. Leaning against a dark sedan, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed but watchful. The general. He straightened when I stepped out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot was quiet again, just like the night before. "You're hard to find," he said finally. "I'm not hiding," I replied. "No," he said, "you're not." There was a faint hint of something in his voice. Respect, maybe. Or understanding. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just want to ask you one question." I didn't answer. "Did you ever wonder what happened to him?" he asked. The words settled into the space between us. Carefully placed. Deliberate. I looked at him. Really looked this time. At the lines etched into his face. The way his shoulders held tension even when he was standing still. The kind of presence that comes from a lifetime of command and the weight that comes with it. "I try not to," I said. He nodded slowly as if he had expected that. "He's alive because of you," he said. I felt something tighten in my chest. "That's what they told me back then too," I replied. And now he asked. I met his eyes. "Now I know better," I said. He studied me for a long moment. Then quietly. "You made a choice." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise either. Just a statement. "Yes," I said. "And you never told anyone why?" I didn't respond. He took a step closer. "Why?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I looked past him out toward the road where the last light of day was starting to fade. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything I said." "That's not true," he said. "It is," I replied. He shook his head. "No," he said. "It would have changed everything." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was familiar. "That depends on who you're trying to protect," I said. Silence settled again. He exhaled slowly like a man adjusting to a truth he didn't like. "I owe you," he said finally. "You don't," I replied. "I do." "You don't," I repeated. He held my gaze. "Then let me ask you this," he said. "If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently?" The question landed harder than the others. Not because I hadn't asked myself the same thing before. Because I had. Every day. I didn't answer right away. When I did, my voice was steady. "No," I said. He nodded once. Not surprised. Not relieved either. Just accepting. "I thought so," he said. Then he stepped back. "Good night," he added. "Good night," I replied. I watched him get into his car and drive away. Then I stood there for a while, the cool air settling around me, the noise of the day finally gone. For years I had convinced myself that what happened back then was over. Closed. Buried. But standing there in that empty lot, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. It hadn't been buried. It had been waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of what he said, but because of what I said. If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently? No. It had come out steady, certain. But certainty and peace aren't the same thing. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the old refrigerator in the next room, replaying the question in a dozen different ways. Each time the answer stayed the same. And each time it felt heavier. The next morning I didn't go straight to work. Instead I drove. Not far at first. Just past the usual turn, then a little further. The road opened up as the town gave way to stretches of flat land and older buildings, places that hadn't changed much in decades. I didn't need directions. My hands knew where they were going. The VA hospital came into view, slowly rising out of the landscape with the same quiet presence it had always had. The brick looked a little more worn now, the parking lot a little fuller, but otherwise it was the same. I parked across the street. Didn't get out right away. It had been years since I'd been back. Years since I'd allowed myself to even drive past. From where I sat, I could see the the automatic doors sliding open and closed as people moved in and out, nurses in scrubs, families carrying overnight bags, veterans walking slower than they probably wanted to. Life going on. Unaffected. Or at least appearing that way. I finally opened the door and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected. I crossed the street slowly, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. Inside, the smell hit me first. Antiseptic, coffee, something faintly metallic underneath it all. It hadn't changed. The lobby looked different, new chairs, updated signage, but the feeling was the same. Controlled, quiet, purposeful. No one stopped me. No one recognized me. That was something I had counted on. I walked down the main hallway past departments I used to move through without thinking. Radiology, cardiology, the ICU wing. I didn't go all the way there. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward a smaller corridor, one most people ignored. Administrative offices. That's where it had started. The door to the old conference room was closed. It used to be open more often than not. A place for quick meetings, case reviews, decisions that needed to be made fast. I stood there for a moment staring at it. Then I pushed it open. The room was empty. A long table, a few chairs, a whiteboard with half-erased notes that didn't mean anything to me anymore. But I could still see it. Not the room as it was now. The room as it had been that night. People sitting where there was no one now, voices overlapping, tension hanging thick in the air. 2 charts on the table. 2 lives. 1 decision. We don't have enough resources. That had been the first thing anyone said out loud. Not a question. A fact. Or 3 is still occupied, someone else added, and ICU is at capacity. We can transfer. No time, I had said. The conversation had shifted then, faster, sharper. Which patient has better odds? That question again. Always that question. On paper it was Daniel. Younger, stronger, fewer underlying conditions. The other man, Earl Patterson, I remembered now, wasn't expected to survive aggressive intervention. Not with his history, not with how far things had progressed. But there was something about him. Not in the chart. In the room. The way he looked at me when I first walked in. Not scared, not confused. Just present. As if he understood something the rest of us were still trying to calculate. Make the call. I turned. He was standing in the doorway. Not in uniform that night, just a suit, but the posture gave him away. The same man who had stood outside the OR later. The general. At the time I didn't know who he was. Only that he wasn't just family. He stepped into the room, his presence shifting the balance without saying much. My son, he said, he's in the other room. Daniel. That was the first time I heard his name. He's stable for now, I replied, but he won't be if we delay. And the other patient, he asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't know. Because I did. He's critical, I said. Multiple complications. Which one has a chance, he pressed. There it was again. Not which one deserves it. Not which one needs it more. Which one has a chance? I looked at the 2 charts again. Then back at him. If it were your son, he said quietly, what would you do? The question had followed me longer than any of the others. Not because it was unfair. Because it wasn't. It was human. And that made it harder. Back in the present, I sat down in one of the chairs, the memory settling over me like a weight I had never fully put down. I hadn't answered him that night. Not out loud. But I had answered. With my hands. With the decision I made next. A soft knock pulled me back. I looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-40s, nurse by the look of her uniform. Can I help you, she asked. I stood. No, I said, I was just passing through. She gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for strangers who didn't quite belong but weren't causing trouble either. All right, she said, just let me know if you need anything. I nodded. Thank you. I left the room without looking back. But the past didn't stay behind. It followed me down the hallway, through the lobby, out into the cold air. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I drove to a place I hadn't visited in even longer. A small cemetery on the edge of town. No gates, no guards, just rows of stones and a gravel path that curved through them. I parked and walked in. I didn't need help finding it. I had been there once before. Years ago. Quiet, Early, before anyone else arrived. I had stood there then just like I did now, looking at a name carved into stone. Earl Patterson. Dates beneath it. A life reduced to numbers. I'm sorry, I had said back then. The words hadn't felt like enough. They didn't now either. I wondered if you'd come back. I turned. He was standing a few yards away. The general. Hands clasped behind his back posture, the same as always. You followed me, I asked. No, he said. I just know where this road leads. I looked back at the stone. You knew him, I said. Yes. Family. He shook his head. Number. I waited. He didn't elaborate right away. Instead, he stepped closer, stopping beside me. He saved my life once, he said finally. The words settled in slowly. Not what I expected. I glanced at him. He was a mechanic, I said. Yes. And he saved your life. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. In ways that don't show up in reports, he said. I looked back at the stone. Something shifted. Not in the facts. In how they connected. He didn't have a chance, I said quietly. The general was silent for a moment. Then, he had you, he said. I let out a slow breath. That wasn't enough, I replied. No, he agreed. We stood there in silence. Two people tied to the same moment for very different reasons. I told them it was my decision, I said after a while. His head turned slightly. What? The hospital, I clarified. The report. I said I made the call alone. You didn't, he said. I did, I replied. That's not what I meant. I looked at him. Then back at the stone. I know, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. They needed someone to blame, I continued, and I was already there. You didn't have to accept it, he said. I shook my head. Yes, I said, I did. He didn't argue. Not this time. What are you going to do now, he asked. The question felt different from the others. Less about the past. More about what came next. I thought about it. About the kitchen. The sink. The life I had built out of smaller, quieter pieces. I don't know, I said honestly. He nodded. As if that answer made sense. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. There's something you should know. I paused. Looked back. The man who died, he said. Earl, he made a request before he lost consciousness. I felt my chest tighten. What kind of request, I asked. The general held my gaze. He asked us not to let anyone else pay for it. The words landed softly, but they didn't feel soft. I didn't respond. Didn't trust myself to. Instead, I nodded once and walked away. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the drawer I had kept closed. Inside was the letter. The one I had never answered. The one that had arrived weeks after everything ended. I held it in my hands for a long time. Then slowly I opened it. The envelope had yellowed at the edges. I had moved 3 times since it arrived, and somehow it had followed me each time, tucked into shoeboxes, slipped between folded papers, buried under things I told myself mattered more. But the truth was, I knew exactly where it was. I always had. The handwriting on the front was careful, not elegant, just deliberate, like every letter had required effort. My name was written without a title. Not doctor. Not inmate number. Just my name. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on low, and the rest of the apartment dark around me. Outside, a truck passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the wall before disappearing. For a long time I only held the letter. Then I unfolded it. There wasn't much inside. A single page. A few short lines. I had read them once years ago, then folded them back up so quickly the paper nearly tore. This time I made myself read slowly. Earl Patterson had written the letter before the final surgery, or maybe asked someone to write it for him. The words were plain simple without any grand language. He said he knew his chances were poor. He said he knew doctors had to make choices regular people would never understand. And then he wrote something I had spent years trying not to remember. If it comes down to me or somebody younger, don't let them waste it on an old man who's already had his turn. I put the letter down. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I pressed my hands flat against the table as if the wood might steady me. For years I had told myself I accepted blame because I made the decision, because the outcome was mine, because no matter what anyone said, Earl Patterson had still died after I chose against the math, and against the policy, and against the safer version of the truth. But that letter complicated everything. It always had. That was why I kept it hidden. Not because it accused me, because it forgave me. And forgiveness, when you don't feel you deserve it, can feel harsher than judgment. The next morning, Martha found me standing behind the restaurant before sunrise. I was early by nearly an hour. The alley still smelled of rain and old cardboard. A delivery truck had left muddy tracks near the back door, and the trash bins leaned slightly from the wind. "You sleep here now?" she asked. I turned. She was carrying 2 coffees. She handed one to me before I could refuse. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "That makes 2 of us." We stood there for a while, sipping coffee in the gray light. Martha owned the catering company with the stubborn pride of someone who had survived too many bad months to be easily impressed by good ones. Her husband had started it 30 years ago as a sandwich counter. After he died, people assumed she would sell. She didn't. She kept the place open through rising rent, broken ovens, late invoices, and brides who wanted champagne taste on soup money. She had hired me without asking questions. That wasn't common. I owed her more than I ever said. "Hospital called," she said finally. My hand tightened around the paper cup. "They called here." "No, they called me because the groom's family asked where you worked. I didn't give them anything personal." "Thank you." She looked at me sideways. "They already know enough, don't they?" I didn't answer. Martha took another sip. "He lived," she said. I heard. "Good." "Yes." She watched me carefully. "You want to tell me who you used to be?" I almost smiled. "Not really." "That's fair." A small silence passed. Then she said, "But maybe you ought to tell yourself." By noon I was back at the sink. Work helped. It always had. The body understands labor better than memory. Soap, water plates, silverware, things that could be cleaned, things that came out better after pressure. Around 3, the back door opened. I looked up. Daniel Mercer's brother stood there again. This time he wasn't alone. The general was with him. Martha stepped between them and the kitchen before I could speak. "We're closed for private prep," she said. The general gave her a polite nod. "We won't stay long." That's what people say before staying long. A faint smile touched his face. "I understand." I dried my hand slowly and came around the sink. "It's all right," I told her. Martha didn't move right away. Then she stepped aside, but not far. "That was Martha. She gave space without abandoning you." The brother looked exhausted. His eyes were red, but his posture had softened. "He's awake," he said. I felt the words before I understood them. "Daniel." He nodded. "He asked what happened. We told him a woman from the kitchen saved him." I looked down. "Then you told him too much." "No," the general said quietly, "not enough." I met his eyes. He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper. For one terrible second I thought it was another letter. It wasn't. It was a photograph. He laid it on the stainless steel prep table between us. I didn't touch it. The photo was old, slightly faded. A younger version of the general stood beside Earl Patterson outside what looked like a motor pool in the desert. Both men were dusty, tired, smiling in the worn-out way soldiers smile when the worst of the day is behind them. But that wasn't what stopped me. Standing between them was a much younger woman in surgical scrubs, hair pulled back, face half turned away from the camera. Me. I stared at it. "I don't remember this," I said. "I know," the general replied. "You weren't meant to. It was taken after the convoy attack. You were attached to the forward surgical team for 3 weeks. The brother looked from him to me. "You served." I shook my head slowly. "Civilian trauma contractor, short rotation. It was before the VA." I had almost forgotten the photo existed because I had almost forgotten the woman in it. Almost. The general tapped the edge of the picture. "Earl kept this." My throat tightened. "He never told me." "He didn't talk much," the general said. "Not about important things." For the first time his voice changed. Just a little. Enough. "He wasn't just a mechanic," he continued. "He was the man who pulled me out of a burning vehicle when I couldn't move. Took shrapnel doing it, never wrote it up, never asked for a medal, said medals were just metal and paperwork." A quiet sadness moved through his face. "That was Earl." I looked at the photograph again. The false shape of the past shifted once more. I had thought the general remembered me because of Daniel. But he remembered me because of Earl too. Because long before that hospital night, all three of us had stood in the same dust under the same hard sun, doing what needed doing and pretending it hadn't marked us. The general looked at me, and when he spoke again his voice was lower. "You saved my life in that field hospital," he said. "Then years later you tried to save the man who saved mine." No one in the kitchen moved. Even Martha had gone still. I swallowed. "That doesn't make me innocent." "No," he said gently, "it makes you human." That nearly broke me. Not the praise. The mercy in it. I turned away and put both hands on the edge of the sink. For years I had worn guilt like punishment because punishment at least gave shape to the loss. But standing there with that photograph on the table, I felt something more frightening than guilt. I felt the possibility that my story was not as simple as I had made it. And I didn't know what to do with that. I asked them to leave the photograph on the table. Not because I wanted to look at it, because I wasn't ready to touch it. The general nodded as if he understood, though I wasn't sure anyone could. Daniel's brother glanced at me once, then followed him toward the back door. Martha watched them go with her arms crossed, her face unreadable in that way of hers. When the door closed, the kitchen seemed to settle around me. The hum of the refrigerator came back. A pot clicked on the stove. Somewhere in the dining room a chair scraped against the floor. Ordinary sounds. Merciful sounds. Martha stepped closer to the table and looked down at the photograph. "Well," she said quietly, "that explains your knife skills." I let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Almost. She didn't smile, neither did I. For a while we just stood there, two women past the age of pretending silence always needed fixing. Then she said, "You planning to run again?" I looked at her. "Again. Don't act like you haven't been running since the day I hired you." I wanted to deny it. But Martha was not a woman you lied to if you respected her. "I didn't know what else to do," I said. She nodded once. "That's different from not having a choice." The words landed harder than I expected. I looked back at the photograph. My younger face stared from the past, half-turned, unaware of everything that would come after. I hardly recognized her. Not because she looked different, but because she still believed usefulness and worth were the same thing. "I made the call," I said. "I know." "No, Martha. You don't." My voice sharpened before I could soften it. People keep trying to turn it into something noble. It wasn't. I stood there with two lives in front of me, and I chose. One man lived, one man died. That is not poetry. That is not redemption. That is blood math. Martha didn't flinch. "No," she said, "it's not poetry." I waited. She picked up a towel and folded it slowly, carefully, as though giving her hands something to do while her mind worked. "But I've run this place long enough to know something about choosing," she continued. "When there isn't enough money to pay every bill, you pick one. When two workers need hours and the register can only carry one of them, you pick one. Smaller stakes, sure. But the feeling is the same. Somebody always pays." I looked away. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she said, "but it makes it real." That was Martha's way. No comfort she didn't believe in, no easy forgiveness, just truth laid down plain. I went back to the sink. The lunch rush came in heavy and strange. Everyone had heard something by then, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Rumors travel faster than food in a restaurant. By 2:00, one of the servers was whispering that I had been a battlefield doctor. By 3, another said I had operated on a senator in Iraq. By 4, someone claimed I had been framed by the government, which would have been almost funny if any part of it felt funny. I kept my head down. Scrubbed pans. Rinsed glasses. Stacked plates. Around 5, Martha came back holding the office phone. "For you." I dried my hands. "Who is it?" "Hospital." My first instinct was to say no. My second was worse. It was to listen. I took the phone. "Hello." A woman's voice came through, professional but cautious. "Is this Eleanor Hart?" I hadn't heard my full name spoken in that tone for years. "Yes." "This is Claire Benton, patient advocate at St. Anselm Medical Center. Mr. Daniel Mercer has asked to speak with you." I closed my eyes. "I'm not family." "He knows." "I'm not his doctor." "He knows that too." The line went quiet. Then the woman added softer, "He said he won't ask again." That was unfair. Or maybe it wasn't. I opened my eyes. When? Tonight, if possible. I looked across the kitchen. Martha stood near the stove, pretending not to listen and listening to every word. "I'll come after my shift," I said. After I hung up, Martha pointed toward the door. "Go now. I have 2 hours left. And I have 6 people who can wash dishes badly until close. Martha, don't make me fire you just to get you moving." So I went. The hospital room was dim when I arrived. Daniel Mercer lay propped against pillows, pale and bruised by machines, though not nearly as fragile as I had expected. His brother sat in a chair by the window. The general stood when I entered. Daniel turned his head. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You look different." I almost smiled. "So do you." His mouth moved as if he wanted to laugh but didn't have the strength. "They told me you saved me. I helped until the paramedics came." That sounds like something a person says when they don't like being thanked. It's something a person says when it's true. He studied me. "I remember you," he said. That surprised me. "From the VA." He nodded faintly. "Pieces, voices mostly. Your voice was calm." I looked down at my hands. He took a slow breath. "My father told me about that night. Years ago. Not everything. Enough." The general's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Daniel continued, "I spent a long time angry at you." "I know." "You don't know." "No," I said. "I suppose I don't." His eyes shifted toward the ceiling. "I thought you had decided I was worth more." The room went still. There it was. The ugly center of it. I looked at him. I didn't. I know that now. "No," I said quietly. "You need to hear me say it. I didn't choose you because of your name, or your father, or your future. I chose what I believed gave both patients the best chance under impossible conditions, and I was wrong about part of it." His eyes glistened, though his voice stayed steady. "Which part?" I thought I could carry it alone. The general looked away. Daniel swallowed. "My brother wants to sue the hospital," he said. I glanced toward the window. His brother didn't deny it. "That's your choice. We need your testimony." There it was. The real reason. Or one of them. I felt the old fear rise, not fear of prison, not even shame. Fear of being dragged back into rooms where words became weapons, and truth became whatever powerful people could afford to shape. Daniel watched me carefully. "I won't ask you to ruin your life again," he said. "You might not have to ask." The general stepped forward. "Eleanor." I turned to him. "You've already paid more than your share," he said. That should have comforted me. Instead, it angered me. "My share," I said. "Earl died. Daniel lived with guilt he didn't earn. Your family carried a lie. The hospital kept its reputation, and I hid in a kitchen because hiding was easier than standing in public and saying I did the best I could, but the best I could was not enough." No one spoke. I looked at Daniel. "I'll testify," I said. His brother stood straighter. "But not for revenge," I added. The room held its breath. "I won't help you turn Earl into a weapon. I won't help you turn me into a saint. And I won't pretend the past becomes clean because a courtroom finally hears it." Daniel nodded slowly. "What do you want then?" I looked at the machines beside his bed. The steady lines, the fragile proof that life was still happening. I want the truth recorded somewhere it can't be buried again. For the first time, the general's face changed. Not shock. Not pride. Something quieter. Relief, maybe. Or grief, finally finding a place to sit down. That night when I left the hospital, the air felt colder than before. I walked to my car, slowly aware of every step. I had spent years believing silence was my punishment. Now I was beginning to understand it had also been my refuge. And stepping out of it would cost me. Maybe more than I wanted to pay. But some debts don't ask whether you are ready. They simply come due. The hearing wasn't held in a courtroom. That surprised people. Daniel's brother had expected something louder. Lawyers, reporters, a room full of strangers waiting to see who would break first. Instead, the hospital's legal team pushed for an internal review panel, 3 physicians, 1 administrator, 1 outside observer, quiet, controlled, recorded but not public. But part of me was relieved. Part of me knew exactly why they wanted it that way. Truth is easier to manage when fewer people are listening. I wore the same jacket I had worn to work for the past 2 years. Nothing special, no statement. Just something that felt like mine. The room itself was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was remembering a different room. There were so many of them back then: conference tables, fluorescent lights, chairs arranged for decisions no one wanted to own. Daniel sat at the far end, still pale but upright, his brother beside him. The general stood near the wall, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. When I walked in, no one announced me. No one needed to. I took the empty seat across from the panel. Ms. Hart, the administrator, began polite but distant thank you for coming. I nodded. We'd like to review the events of... I know what you'd like, I said gently. Let's not waste time pretending this is about clarification. A flicker passed across his face. One of the physicians, older gray-haired, leaned forward. Then tell us what you believe it is about. I held his gaze. Responsibility, I said, and what we're willing to admit about how it gets assigned. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. They asked their questions. I answered them. Not defensively, not emotionally, just plainly. 2 patients, limited resources, 1 decision. They tried to circle back to protocol, to guidelines, to the framework that makes difficult choices look structured on paper. I didn't argue the framework. I told them where it broke. You had a triage system, I said. It favored projected survival rates. It favored patients with fewer complications. It also unofficially favored patients whose outcomes mattered more to the hospital. The administrator shifted in his chair. That's an unfair characterization. No, I replied. It's an incomplete one, but not unfair. I glanced at Daniel. At the time, I believed following the system would lead to 1 death. Breaking from it might save both. I was wrong. The gray-haired physician spoke again. And knowing what you know now. The same question. A different room. I didn't hesitate. I would make the same call, I said. Daniel's brother inhaled sharply. The administrator looked almost satisfied, as if that answer confirmed something he wanted on record. But the physician didn't move on. Explain, he said. I nodded. Because the decision wasn't about choosing one life over another, I said. It was about refusing to let the system decide without challenge. I believed there was a path that gave both men a chance. I took it. I failed one of them. That failure belongs to me. But so does the refusal to accept that the outcome was predetermined by policy. The outside observer, a woman I hadn't noticed speaking yet, leaned forward. Why didn't you say this before? That question mattered more than the others. I thought about it. Because it wouldn't have changed anything I said at first? Then I shook my head slightly. That's not entirely true, I corrected myself. It would have changed how the hospital defended itself. It would have exposed decisions made above my level. It would have made a larger problem visible. And I chose not to do that. Why, she asked. I looked down at my hands. Then back up. Because I was tired, I said. And because I believed protecting the system might protect future patients more than dismantling it would. The room absorbed that. Not agreement. Not condemnation. Just recognition. They brought up Earl Patterson's letter. I hadn't expected that. The administrator slid a copy across the table. We obtained this from Mr. Patterson's records, he said. It appears he expressed a preference regarding treatment prioritization. I didn't reach for it. I've read it, I said. And yet you did not include it in your original report. Number. Why? Because a patient's willingness to sacrifice himself doesn't remove the physician's responsibility to try. The gray-haired doctor nodded slowly. That's consistent with medical ethics. It's also consistent with human guilt, I said. That earned a few faint reactions. When the questions ended, the room grew still. The administrator folded his hands. The panel will deliberate and issue a statement, he said. I stood. I'm not here for your statement, I replied. He blinked. Then why are you here? I looked at Daniel. For him, I said, and for the record. The outside observer spoke again. What do you want the record to reflect? I took a breath. That the system failed 2 patients that night, I said. Not just 1. That responsibility was narrowed to a single decision because it was easier than examining the structure that created it. and that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't prevent harm, it just changes who carries it. No one wrote that down immediately. But I knew it would be recorded. Somewhere. Afterward, there were no announcements, no dramatic exits. People stood, papers were gathered, chairs moved. Daniel approached me slowly. "You didn't clear your name," he said. "That wasn't the goal." "They're still going to say you were wrong." "I was wrong," I said. He studied me. "Not the way they mean." I didn't answer that. His brother stepped forward next. "We're not filing the lawsuit," he said. That surprised me. "Why?" He glanced at Daniel. "Because this isn't something a settlement fixes." No, it wasn't. The general waited until the others had gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "You gave him back his life twice," he said. I shook my head. "I gave him time, I corrected. What he does with it is his." He nodded. "That's more than most people get." We walked out together. Not as allies. Not as strangers either. Something in between. A week later, I went back to work. Same sink. Same plates. Same rhythm. Nothing about the kitchen had changed. But I had. Not in a way anyone else could see. Martha handed me an envelope around mid-morning. "No return address," she said. Inside was a short note. No signature. Just a single line written in careful, deliberate handwriting. "You did what I couldn't ask you to do." I knew who it was from. I folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. Then into my pocket. There was also a check. I left it in the envelope. Money doesn't settle debts like that. That evening after closing, I stayed behind again. The kitchen was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned. I stood at the sink, hands resting on the edge, looking at the reflection in the steel. For years I had seen only what I lost. The title. The career. The version of myself that moved through the world with certainty. Now I saw something else. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Just continuity. A life that hadn't ended when everything else did. A life that had changed shape. And maybe in some ways grown more honest. If you've listened this far, I won't tell you what to think about what I did. I won't ask you to decide whether I was right or wrong. Life doesn't divide itself that cleanly, no matter how much we want it to. But I will say this. There are moments when you won't have enough information, enough time, or enough certainty to make a perfect choice. And you'll have to choose anyway. When that moment comes, I hope you choose with as much care as you can carry, and that you find a way afterward to live with what that choice costs. If this story meant something to you or reminded you of a moment you've had to carry, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, quiet, complicated, and human, you're always welcome here.